And I am currently serving as the president of the Latino American Law Students Association, which is formerly or currently known as the LALSA here on campus. There we go. Okay, so LALSA strives to bring Latin Americans' vibrant culture to Widener's campus. We also attempt to increase awareness about key issues impacting the Latino community through service and different engagement events. And we also hope to encourage students, faculty, and staff to engage in activities that reflect Latin Americans' diverse culture. Who do we represent? So I missed one of these flags, but we currently represent 9 different countries here at Widener. We have the Dominican Republic, Panama, Cuba, Haiti, Mexico, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Colombia, and my treasurer is also part Peruvian, so I forgot to put his flag up there. But those are the countries that we represent. This is our executive board. We are currently looking for new board members for our next executive board, and we will be hosting elections next month. So if anybody has any questions about the roles and responsibilities in any of these executive boards or executive roles, please let any of us know, and we'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Some past events that we've had, our popular event that we've had 3 times now is Salsa Night. We have a Zumba instructor that comes in, and she comes in on Zoom, and we do different salsa dances and different Latin American dances with music and food and stuff like that. It's a really fun time, and we have it like 5 to 6 p.m. so people can come before classes and kind of just chill and have fun. Another event that we had last year was Espresso and Esquires. It was a networking event highlighting minority attorneys in the area. Honorable Judge Morris was one of our panelists, so it was a really fun event last year. We also are collaborating with the Hispanic Bar Association. They are currently headquartered in Philly, but we're trying to get I guess, conglomerate of attorneys in the central PA area, because there are a lot of Hispanic attorneys here, but they're not really connected to the Hispanic Bar Association in central Pennsylvania. And then we also try to do a semester service project every semester. Last semester, we did a local food drive, and we collected canned goods for the Bethesda Mission, which is a local shelter here in Harrisburg. Lastly, one of the things that we always do at our events is talk about current events in the Latino community. So I tried to pick events that were reflective of some of the issues that Latin American law students face. And one of the things that I found was that the U.S. Supreme Court is now more diverse than the lawyers that argue before it. And Justice Sotomayor was asked about how to tackle this issue. And she said that she encourages minority students to apply for federal judicial clerkships and externships, and that will hopefully kind of give minority law students an opportunity to possibly argue before the Supreme Court in the future. And then another current event that I found is that Hispanics account for more than half of the nation's population growth in the last decade. I think that this is something that's really important, because as the Hispanic population continues to increase, I think there also needs to be increased awareness about the issues that impact our community. And I think that LALSA is the perfect organization to give law students the platform to speak about those issues. And that is all from LALSA. So thank you very much.
We don't have a power. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Kelsey Johnson. I am the Vice President of the Black Law Students Association. Unfortunately, I was brought in to do this presentation kind of last minute on behalf of our president, who couldn't be here today. So we don't have a PowerPoint, as LALSA does, but I'll just be speaking to you guys. So the National Black Law Student Association is a national organization. We host over 6,000 members across the country, and as well as we have chapters in the Bahamas, Nigeria, and as newly as South Africa. We are the largest law student organization in the country. We were founded in 1968 by a few spearheaded legal professionals who wanted to create safe spaces for Black students who were experiencing extreme racism, prejudices, and just horrible experiences at their law schools. The BALSA encourages the development of talented, social conscious lawyers of tomorrow. Our association, which many don't know, operates on not just a local level, but also a regional level and a national level. We were formed to articulate and proclamate the needs and goals of Black law students, as well as to effectuate the change in the legal community. The goal of our chapter here at Widener is to do exactly that. And because we are a small chapter, one of our goals, as far as when I became a 1L, was to really make a change as far as getting into the faces of our Black students, finding out what they need, what are their problems here, what are the issues that they're not being able to express safely in their classrooms and in their communities around students. And as many of us here who come from diverse backgrounds, we understand that our needs are a little bit different than those of our counterparts at a PWI. We have strived to not only get to those needs of goals of Black students, but also to provide an environment where allies feel welcome to join in and learn about our experiences as Black students and what they can do to help out. We have held events here at Widener, including a panel of Black and Brown attorneys who come from different paths, who are interested in different areas of law, and who can kind of just speak to us and give us some inspiration on how we can get to a place where they are. They have faced the same struggles that we have. They have walked the paths that we want to walk. So we try to bring in attorneys and legal professionals that can speak to those issues. We have also had discussions about police brutality. That was one of our most recent events where we kind of held an intimate professional setting where we talked about the most recent tragedy of Black African Americans who have died to the hands of police brutality. It was a tough discussion, but it's one that is needed. It's one that I'm very passionate about continuing to have here at Widener. There are issues that sometimes we kind of overlook to kind of protect the safe space of each other, but these are the hard discussions that we really do need to have here. And I hope that BALSA and other organizations will continue to have those discussions. We also pride ourselves on having lighthearted events, such as annual field day happening in April. We have game nights, we have holiday parties just to kind of help students relieve some stress before finals. Our organization here at Widener is small, but it is our goal to continue to live up to the mission of the national organization. This past week over spring break, I had the pleasure of attending the national convention that was in Washington, D.C. Ketanji Brown-Jackson, Justice Brown-Jackson actually was able to send us a personal message, and that was really, really awesome. I was able to serve as the national moot court director of the Thurgood Marshall Moot Court competition, where I spearheaded over 70 teams from different law schools from across the country. So that was really, really a really, really awesome opportunity for me to do. And I hope that students of all backgrounds will continue to come to BALSA events, will continue to look to the needs of our students that don't often get the attention that they need. So that's a little bit about BALSA. And again, our events are open to all students, not just Black students, but we are focused on the issues that Black students face. So thank you.
All right, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So my name is Royce. I'm a current 2L here at Widener, and I have the pleasure of being the president of Outlaw, which is a student-run organization here. We represent lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and other queer identifying individuals and their allies here. We are dedicated to creating a safe, judgment-free space and providing various social, educational, and professional opportunities for students interested in advocating and learning about the LGBTQ community. Our mission is to educate in a setting that fosters diversity, openness, differing perspectives, respect, and equality. We strive to create dialogue here about the legal status of LGBTQ individuals, how the law interacts with the community, and navigating queerness within the legal profession. All students are welcome, and we encourage allies, especially, to join this organization. Your presence and allyship here is incredibly impactful to our campus community, so we appreciate you being here. This past year, we have held stress-relieving social events, educational events on campus, and fundraisers for local LGBTQ organizations in Central PA. We are also in the process of establishing a name change clinic here on campus. This name change clinic will help the local community in the guidance of legally changing their names. And I am incredibly proud to represent Outlaw and incredibly excited to see this organization's future accomplishments. So thank you for your attention. I would now like to introduce our Dean, Michael J. Hussey. Dean Hussey is currently serving his third year as the Dean of Widener Commonwealth Law School. Dean Hussey teaches and writes in the areas of taxation, business organizations, and wills, trusts, and estate planning. He is the founding director of the law school's Innovative Business Advising Program and continues to serve as the faculty director of the Commonwealth's Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. Dean Hussey is the past recipient of the Commonwealth's Teacher of the Year Award as selected by the graduating class. Dean Hussey serves as the chair of the United Way of the Capital Region Money in Your Pocket Steering Committee and as co-chair of the United Way of the Capital Region Community Impact Committee. Dean Hussey is also on the board of directors for the United Way of the Capital Region. Central Penn Business Journal recognized Dean Hussey as one of Harrisburg's area's 40 under 40. Before joining the Widener Law Commonwealth faculty, Dean Hussey practiced law in Belleville, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. Dean Hussey graduated summa cum laude from St. Louis, Missouri, and magna cum laude from St. Louis, Missouri School of Law. Dean Hussey also received his LLM in taxation from Washington University School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Dean Hussey. Thank you.
Good morning. Welcome to all of you. It's good to see all of you here. Let me begin by thanking Royce for that very gracious and kind introduction, and to Savannah and Kelsey and Royce for welcoming all of you here to the 2023 Dean's Diversity Forum and sharing with you a little bit about each of their organizations and the work, the great work that they do here on campus. This is our 16th annual Dean's Diversity Forum, and we're just so very excited to have all of you here with us, and we have almost 60 people joining us online as well, and we're delighted to have you there as well. We have a new twist this year to this forum. On the way in, for those of you here in the room with us, you should have received a raffle ticket to win one of the paintings behind me that our friend Judge Nathan Nichols donated to this year's Dean's Diversity Forum. I'm pleased to share that he has given the law school permission to keep one of these paintings, but the other two will go home with some of you in this room today. So please make sure that you filled out the back of that raffle ticket and you have turned it in at the registration desk out front. The paintings are the work of Kenyan artist James Mutasia Kasamba, born in 1971, which I must say is a very, very, very good year to be born. Mr. Kasamba has painted full-time in Kenya since 1995 and has participated in numerous exhibitions beginning in 1999. He is among Kenya's national treasures and has been known to be found painting on the veranda of the Karen Blixen Museum, part of the National Museums of Kenya. Mr. Kasamba's work brings hope and encouragement to Mother Teresa's Home of Mercy in Huruma, Kenya, and has been featured on Christmas cards for the Ford Foundation. Mr. Kasamba and his work have also been recognized for superior achievement by Kenya's Sutherland Paints. The contact information for Mr. Kasamba's gallery can be found in the materials for the forum. The law school would certainly like to thank both Mr. Kasamba and Judge Nichols for this generous contribution and these powerful images as a part of this year's Dean's Diversity Forum. So, why are we here today? The next compliance period doesn't end until April 30th for our CLE credits, so there's still a good 6 weeks to get all of that in. Perhaps we are here because lawyers deal with words, and James Baldwin was primarily a writer, primarily someone who deals with words. Perhaps we are here to encounter the words of a writer. That seems very unlikely. After all, there are less threatening, less haunting, more timely, and more comfortable words out there than those of James Baldwin. I think we are here today because we have realized a fight continues, and we feel called to be a part of that fight. It is an ancient fight by American standards, a fight waged on our soil even before we became a nation, a fight James Baldwin was both absorbed by and transcended. The fight to which James Baldwin has called us today is not for some social design, some social construct, or some political philosophy. The fight to which he calls us and continues to call us even now is for our brothers and sisters to become all that they can be. Our brothers and sisters extend far beyond those who look like us or see like us. Indeed, we are fighting to save even those we cannot see, because as James Baldwin was apt to remind us, if we do not bring such people to the light, they will die in the darkness. At the founding of our nation, the Declaration of Independence embraced two principles upon which our nation was to be built. First, that all men, all people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And second, that our government was to be instituted but for one purpose, to enable we the people to secure these rights. 12 years later, the people of the United States ratified the design for the government built on those principles. That design, the Constitution, claimed for its authors, we the people, all Americans. And the preamble of the Constitution insists that the government it was creating and did create would not pursue just the welfare of the great or the powerful or the popular or the privileged, but the general welfare, the welfare of all. To be an American in that moment was to acknowledge what the Declaration had made so foundational, that all people have a right to a life, to liberty, to pursue all they can be and all that is good, and that all people have a duty to guarantee those rights for the other person. Thus, when James Baldwin confronted 20th century America, he did not carry with him a blank slate. Instead, he came armed with unfulfilled promises, and he came insisting on the fulfillment of those promises already too long unfulfilled. When he came, James Baldwin did not come as an outsider or a foreigner or a child of some distant nation. He came as a fellow American, a member of we the people. As Baldwin himself observed, the American soil is full of the corpses of my ancestors. Why is my freedom or my citizenship or my right to live there? How is it conceivably a question now? While some were content to limit the demands of American democracy to a right to vote, Baldwin would not let the land of his sojourn get off so cheaply. We know, he said, that democracy does not mean the coercion of all into a deadly and finally wicked mediocrity, but the liberty for all to aspire to the best that is in him or that has ever been. On the streets of Harlem, where Baldwin grew up, school was a place where education did not occur. Neighborhood was a place where one did not feel safe. Family was a place where you grew up to watch your children's dreams die, just as yours did. When such streets would descend into chaos, Baldwin refused to allow his fellow Americans to be surprised. What causes, he observed, the eruptions, the riots, the revolts, whatever you want to call them, is the despair of being in a static position, absolutely static, of watching your father, your brother, your uncle, or your cousin, no matter how old the black cat is or how young, who has no future. Where were we the people? Where was pursuing the general welfare on those streets? Were they not to be guarantees woven into the fabric of our nation? Were they not to be nothing more than the glittering deception designed to appease young children? As Baldwin explained, it comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the country to which you have pledged your allegiance along with everyone else has not pledged allegiance to you. The most enduring accomplishments of James Baldwin's life were not the books, nor the plays, nor the essays. They were what he made of himself and what he continues to nurture in us. James Baldwin found in New York on the streets of his childhood that the color of my skin stood between myself and me. However, he refused to allow such barriers to stay there. After all, he had a right to achieve his best self and a duty to help others to do the same, and he would not give those over to darkness. James Baldwin would not be the victim of other men's realities. As he put it, I did not intend to allow the white people of this country to tell me who I was and limit me that way and polish me off that way. You have somehow to begin to break out of all of that and try to become yourself. It's hard for anybody, but it's very hard if you're born Black in a white society. And the fight to which James Baldwin called us, and still calls us, we often hear of segregation. There can be no we the people and no general welfare on segregated streets. Still, segregation can be a nuanced concept, content to hide in the shadows and the subtleties. On the streets of Baldwin's boyhood home, segregation was not so much simply a segregation of the races as a segregation of conscience. The question Baldwin shared really is a kind of apathy and ignorance, which is the price we pay for segregation. That's what segregation means. You don't know what is happening on the other side of the wall because you don't want to know. Once you realize, he continued, that you can do something, it would be difficult to live with yourself if you didn't do it. For nearly 3 decades, a wall divided Berlin east from west. James Baldwin insisted that for over 4 centuries, a wall has divided our own country. On one side of that wall, there are those who suffer from despair. On the other side, there are those who suffer from ignorance. The cure for each lies in the salvation of the other. The wall must come down, and we, the people, must finally pursue together the general welfare. As James Baldwin would have us know, we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is. So thank you for joining us this morning. I would like to introduce the speakers for our first panel, and then we'll have a short video presentation after that. There are more complete bios for each of our speakers in the materials for the forum. Our first speaker is Joseph Robinson Jr. Since its inception in 2009, he has served as president of the Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Development Institute, a local think tank and developer of community leaders trained in the tenets of Dr. King. Mr. Robinson also serves as a strategic consultant with Dame Leadership. He formerly served as the executive director of the South Central PA Sickle Cell Council. He also chaired the statewide PA Sickle Cell Provider Network and nationally served on the Leadership Council of the Sickle Cell Disease Association of America. Mr. Robinson is retired from the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation with 26 years of service, last serving in a senior management position as chief of the Performance Improvement and Metrics Division. He is the author of 7 Leadership Imperatives from a Wild Man. Since its publication in 2008, over 3,000 people have been trained in Mr. Robinson's leadership model outlined in that book. He has served as an ordained deacon of the Greater Zion Missionary Baptist Church since 1986. Mr. Robinson has also served in many additional capacities at the church, including as the church's first director of ministries for the 70 ministries of the church. He is married to Edna M. Robinson. Their son Michael resides in Kuwait with his wife Seneca. Their daughter Brittany is a graduate of Howard University and resides in Bowie, Maryland, with her husband, Reginald Bernard, and their children, Eliza Joseph and Harper Judith. His extended family also includes his big brother, big sister, little brother, Dante Davis. Our second speaker on the first panel this morning is Samuel T. Cooper III, who is currently of counsel at Dilworth Paxson, LLP, where he was formerly a partner with a multidimensional practice centered on municipal finance, real estate, land use, municipal government, business law, and estates. Sam has represented a multitude of public and private entities in often complex and highly visible manners, and has been described as a godsend for his work with the Harrisburg School District. He has long served both the legal community and the Widener community and a wider community in a number of examples, and the Widener community as well. He's often with us here. Sam is, for example, a former member of the Pennsylvania Bar Association Board of Governors, a former president of the Dauphin County Bar Association, a former member of both the PA Continuing Legal Education Board and the PA Interbranch Commission for Gender, Racial, and Ethnic Fairness. He is also a co-founder of the PBA Diversity Summit. In addition, he has served on the Holy Spirit Hospital Board of Directors and with the Harrisburg NAACP and the United Way of the Capital Region. He is a popular lecturer for the Pennsylvania Bar Institute. He was recognized in the 2021 to 23 editions of the Best Lawyers in America and as a Martindale-Hubbell Distinguished Attorney. In addition, Sam has received the Legal Intelligencer's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015 and was also the Legal Intelligencer's Diversity Attorney of the Year recipient in 2009. Sam has been honored with the PBA Lifetime Achievement Award and the United States Postal Service Legacy Award and the Professional Achievement Award from the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. He is a graduate of Yale University, where he was a member of the Elihu Society and the Dickinson School of Law. So it's my pleasure to welcome both of them to our first panel this morning. And I believe Brian is going to cue up our first video for us.
What is relevant about this is that whereas 40 years ago when I was born, the question of having to deal with what is unspoken by the subjugated, what is never said to the master, of having to deal with this reality was a very remote possibility. It was in no one's mind. When I was growing up, I was taught in American history books that Africa had no history, and neither did I. That I was a savage, about whom the less said the better, who had been saved by Europe and brought to America. And of course, I believed it. I didn't have much choice. Those are the only books there were. Everyone else seemed to agree. If you walk out of Harlem, ride out of Harlem downtown, the world agrees. What you see is much bigger, cleaner, whiter, richer, safer than where you are. They collect the garbage. People obviously can pay their life insurance. The children look happy, safe. You're not. And you go back home. And it would seem then, of course, that it's an act of God, that this is true, that you belong where white people have put you. It is only since the Second World War that there's been a counter-image in the world. And that image not come about through any legislation on the part of any American government, but through the fact that Africa was suddenly on the stage of the world, and Africans had to be dealt with in a way they'd never been dealt with before. This gave an American Negro for the first time a sense of himself beyond a savage or a clown. It has created, and will create, a great many conundrums. One of the great things that the white world does not know, but I think I do know, is that black people are just like everybody else. One has used the myth of Negro and the myth of color to pretend and to assume that you are dealing essentially with something exotic, bizarre, and practically, according to human laws, unknown. Alas, it is not true. We are also mercenaries, dictators, murderers, liars. We are human too. What is crucial here is that unless we can manage to establish some kind of dialogue between those people whom I pretend have paid for the American dream and those other people who have not achieved it, we will be in terrible trouble. I want to say at the end, at the last, is that that is what concerns me most. We are sitting in this room, and we are all, at least we like to think we are, relatively civilized, and we can talk to each other at least on certain levels, so that we could walk out of here assuming that the measure of our enlightenment, or at least our politeness, has some effect on the world. It may not. I remember, for example, when the ex-Attorney General, Mr. Robert Kennedy, said that it was conceivable that in 40 years in America we might have a Negro president. And that sounded like a very emancipated statement, I suppose, to white people. They were not in Harlem when this statement was first heard, and did not hear, and possibly will never hear, the laughter and the bitterness and the scorn with which the statement was greeted. From the point of view of the man in the Harlem barbershop, Bobby Kennedy only got here yesterday. And now he's already on his way to the presidency. We've been here for 400 years, and now he tells us that maybe in 40 years, if you're good, we may let you become president. What is dangerous here is the turning away from anything any white American says. The reason for the political hesitation in spite of the Johnson landslide is the one that's been betrayed by American politicians for so long. And I am a grown man, and perhaps I can be reasoned with. I certainly hope I can be. But I don't know, and neither does Martin Luther King, none of us know how to deal with those other people whom the white world has so long ignored, who don't believe anything the white world says and don't entirely believe anything I or Martin say. And one can't blame them. You watch what has happened to them in less than 20 years. It seems to me that the city of New York, for example, this is my last point, which has had Negroes in it for a very long time. If the city of New York were able, as it has indeed been able, in the last 15 years to reconstruct itself, tear down buildings and raise great new ones, downtown and for money, and has done nothing whatever except build housing projects in the ghetto for the Negroes. And of course the Negroes hate it. Presently the property does indeed deteriorate because the children cannot bear it. They want to get out of the ghetto. If the American pretensions were based on more solid, a more honest assessment of life and of themselves, it would not mean for Negroes, when someone says urban renewal, that Negroes simply are going to be thrown out into the streets, which is what it does mean now. This is not an act of God. We're dealing with a society made and ruled by men. If the American Negro had not been present in America, I am convinced that the history of the American labor movement would be much more edifying than it is. It is a terrible thing for an entire people to surrender to the notion that 1/9 of its population is beneath them. And until that moment, until the moment comes when we, the Americans, we, the American people, are able to accept the fact that I have to accept, for example, that my ancestors are both white and black, that on that continent we are trying to forge a new identity for which we need each other, and that I am not a ward of America. I am not an object of missionary charity. I am one of the people who built the country. Until this moment, there is scarcely any hope for the American dream, because the people who are denied participation in it, by their very presence, will wreck it. And if that happens, it's a very grave moment for the West. Thank you.
Good morning. Dean Hussey, thank you. Friend Professor Lee, thank you for allowing me to participate here today with this august body of panelists, these legal jurists. I got up this morning and said, and what am I doing here? But like they said at Hamilton, I'm not throwing away my shot. So I'm going to go ahead and say something this morning. You heard it said that I'm a Baptist deacon. I'm not going to take you to church completely, but in case you haven't been in a while, this will be good for you. But I have to recall the preacher, the school teacher. She wanted to kind of prep her kids because the pastor was coming to visit the classroom. And so she said, now we got to go over some basic etiquette, because the pastor's coming. So we want to be on point. She said, now when the pastor walks in the room and he raises his hand like that, what are we supposed to do? The kid said, we're supposed to stand up. She said, very good. Then when he buzzes, takes his hand like that, what do we do? They said, we sit down. Very good. And when he takes his watch off and sits it up on the podium, what does that mean? One little boy in the back said, absolutely nothing. The clip you just heard this morning is an excerpt from a debate at the University of Cambridge on February the 18th, 1965, between Mr. Baldwin and the father of modern American conservatism, William F. Buckley. James Baldwin was one of the most relevant voices of his day and a contemporary of Dr. King, Malcolm, and the many civil rights champions of the 1960s. Through both his writing and his oratory, he decried racism, asking only that Black people be recognized for their humanity and that they be treated as equals. He fought hard against what Isabel Wilkerson characterizes as the caste system that places Black people on the lowest rung of the ladder merely because of color. As Dr. King stated, the Negro's color became a stigma to white America when the Africans were brought here in chains in 1619. Baldwin, a gay Black man, highly acclaimed author, and defender of everyone's right to live their lives, famously said, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." For the benefit of those who may not have read extensively of Baldwin, I think it's necessary to provide a glimpse into his life from his youth forward, just a glimpse. He was born in 1924 in Harlem to a domestic worker, Emma Jones, without a father. By the age 12, his mother had married a factory worker and Pentecostal preacher, David Baldwin, whose surname he took as his own. Although he and his stepfather had a tumultuous relationship, he eventually emulated him, and by age 14, was himself preaching regularly in the church. This early church involvement would shape his literary works, such as Go Tell It on the Mountain. But prior to that, in 1941, at age 17, he left the church and his parents and moved to Greenwich Village, where he became influenced by the writer Richard Wright, author of Native Son, who was then twice the age of Baldwin. Frustrated by the racial prejudice he experienced in New York, he moved to Paris, France in 1948 at the age of 24. It was there in 1956 he wrote Giovanni's Room, which explored bisexuality and interracial relationships. After 8 years living abroad, having observed the racism in America through the lens of a less racially restrictive locale, he returned to Harlem, New York in 1957 and immersed himself into the civil rights movement. And during this time, it included extensive travel in the Jim Crow South. And during that time, he would author his book, The Fire Next Time, in 1963, the same year as that famous March on Washington. Having met King in 1957, just a year after that successful boycott, bus boycott, Baldwin wrote of King in 1961 these words. He said, "The Negro Church was playing the same role it has always played in Negro life, but it had acquired a new power." In 1965, he joined the march from Selma to Montgomery, 3 weeks after the bloody Sunday march led by the late Congressman John Lewis across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Although he fundamentally believed nonviolence was the best approach in order to achieve racial equality, his pragmatic beliefs fell somewhere between King and Malcolm. He absolutely understood why Northern City Blacks, particularly in Harlem, gravitated toward Malcolm's more strident and defiant rhetoric. Incidentally, Malcolm was assassinated on February 21st, just 3 days after that speech you just saw on the screen. Now, let me elaborate when I say that he fell somewhere in between. In order to do that, we need to talk a little bit about Malcolm and Martin. Malcolm, just like Baldwin, was a Harlem resident. He had experienced trauma at an early age growing up in Lansing, Michigan. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist preacher and a follower of Marcus Garvey, who urged Black people to become independent of whites and self-sufficient. Mr. Little was hit by a streetcar, but it's believed that he was targeted because of his embrace and propagation of Garvey's separatist philosophy. His mother would later be committed to an asylum, and he and his siblings placed in foster care. He ultimately began a life of street hustling and crime and was incarcerated for 5 years. It was there that he learned of the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad of the Nation of Islam. Following his release in 1952, up until 1965, just 13 short years, he inspired Northern Blacks in Harlem and elsewhere to resist discrimination, racism, and brutality by anyone, including the police, initially by any means necessary, a stance he later abandoned after his spiritual awakening during a Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. Conversely, Dr. King was raised in an upper middle class home, also by a Baptist preacher in Atlanta, Georgia. However, he attended Morehouse College, Crozier Theological Seminary, and Boston University. He accepted a call to pastor the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, at the age of 26. And from 1955 until 1968, again, just 13 short years, he inspired Southern Blacks in particular and Blacks worldwide to reject discrimination, racism, and brutality, but through nonviolent protest. Coincidentally, on April 4th, 1968, 3 years after the assassination of Malcolm, while in Los Angeles writing a screenplay about the life of Malcolm, Baldwin learned of King's assassination. He purchased a new suit and attended the funeral, and he said, "I did not want to weep for Martin. Tears seemed futile. I may also have been afraid, and I could not have been the only one, that if I began to weep, I would not be able to stop." I suspect it's the same emotion and anguish experienced 50 years later by Dr. Michael Eric Dyson when he published a sermon in book form to white America titled, "Tears We Cannot Stop." After King and Malcolm were killed, Baldwin became angry and disillusioned and returned to France. In an interview with Esquire magazine, he said, "I don't think that the death of Martin Luther King means very much to any of those people in Washington. I don't think they understand what happened at all. People like Governor Wallace and Mr. Maddox certainly don't. I would doubt very much if Ronald Reagan does. And that is, of course, where the problem lies. To the Black people in this country, it means that you have declared war. You have declared war, that you do intend to slaughter us, that you intend to put us in concentration camps." In 1974, he authored "If Beale Street Could Talk," a scathing critique of the civil rights movement. In his latter days, he traveled back and forth from Europe to the United States, eventually teaching in Western Massachusetts. He died in 1987 of stomach cancer at the young age of 63. I call that young since I'm 65. Now, I'm about to ready to close my remarks, and you hear that often if you go to church enough, the preacher say, "I'm about to close now." He'll say that 3 times. But throughout his life, Baldwin wrote and spoke using provocative language to try and wake up America in general and Black people in particular. And there are at least 4 recurring themes throughout his writing and his speeches. And I'm almost done. He talks about the pull of love and hate between Black and whites. It was the Galilean master teacher who posed the existential question, how can you say you love God whom you've never seen, yet hate your brother who you see every day? He talked about the guilt and shame concerning sexuality. And yet the Pauline writer we so revere reminds us there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. He talked about the absence of spiritual and moral values. Even our music encourages this live and let live attitude. Back in '69, the Isley Brothers had a #1 hit titled, "It's Your Thing, Do What You Want to Do." Pink Floyd's came along with Another Brick Wall, shouting, "Hey teachers, leave those kids alone." And Bobby Brown defiantly declared, "It's my prerogative. I do what I want to do." He also, and finally, he talked about sharing and extending love. Love is a verb disguised as a noun. It's an unsolicited, unprompted action driven by compulsion rather than compunction. Genuine love will give you a bad case of the can't help it. In summation, like Dr. King's indictment of the three evils of racism, poverty, and war, Baldwin opposed racism, industrialism, materialism, and the global struggle for power. As hard as it may be for some of us to accept that this world began before we arrived and that it will continue long after we have departed, we have to embrace that thought. Because as President Harry S. Truman said, the only thing new in this world is the history you don't know. Be encouraged. I defer now to my co-presenter, Elder Samuel Cooper.
Good morning. I hope all can hear me. First of all, I'd like to welcome the opportunity to participate in this year's Dean's Diversity Forum and thank Widener Commonwealth Law School, Dean Michael Hussey and Professor Randy Lee, the Black Law Students Association, Latino American Law Students Association, and Outlaw for the invitation to do so. I especially cherish the opportunity to address you regarding James Baldwin and his involvement with the forum's theme of race, rights, and a re-encounter with light. Before I get into that, just let me say that I really cherish also the chance to participate with Joseph Robinson, whom I've known for a number of years now. And he just demonstrated to me once again that it's a hard act to follow a Baptist minister or a Baptist deacon in that sense. So he's definitely a hard act to follow. And I truly appreciate his comments about James Baldwin. I will focus my presentation on Baldwin and his treatment of race and rights and a re-encounter with light, primarily in the context of American law and its justice and legal systems and his preoccupation with those topics. Those three topics are subjects and themes that permeate his writings and pronouncements, particularly as they relate to African Americans and the history of their presence in America. I will begin my talk with a concept central to the writings, that of the, quote, Negro problem, unquote. Throughout my discourse today, I will refer to Black, Negro, and African American, and will use those names interchangeably. Well, what is the Negro problem? Much of Baldwin's writings concern America's Negro problem and America's inability to solve it. The noted African-American scholar and writer, W.E.B. Du Bois, noted or couched the Negro problem in sociological parlance as a cluster of social problems affecting American Negroes. Viewed another way, it can be defined as America's race problem and dilemma of what to do with this Negro population. That is, whether Negroes should be granted freedom, full citizenship, and an equal opportunity to share in the riches of American society. That dilemma is one whose existence can be traced back over the past 4 centuries plus, well before the founding of this country, and one which, in my view, still exists. That dilemma and the 400-year history of it underscore the fact that there have been 2 Americas that are a dichotomy still very much alive today. That dichotomy takes on the following primary forms: Black and white, free and enslaved, rich and poor, and privileged and underprivileged. Baldwin was keenly aware of that dichotomy. As to the 400+ year history of the Negro problem, let me talk about the history of it in the sense of this. Africans first arrived as Spanish slaves on August 9, 1526, in Widener Bay, South Carolina, with Spanish explorer Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon in a failed attempt to start a colony. Thereafter, in 1565, the Spanish colony of St. Augustine in Florida, and by the way, as you know, St. Augustine still exists to this day, became the first permanent European settlement and colony, and it included an unknown number of enslaved as well as free Africans. Later in 1619, the first recorded enslaved Africans in English North America were brought first to Fort Monroe off the coast of Hampton, Virginia, and then to Jamestown, Virginia. They had been taken from a captured Portuguese slave ship. In keeping with our forum's theme, I shall next explore a few key developments in the legal history of the Negro presence in America, which I believe Baldwin was aware of. Any thorough review of America's Negro problem and its association with Baldwin necessarily includes a consideration of the various laws and judicial decisions and pivotal events in the history of this country that have impacted on its treatment of African Americans and their place in American society. I will briefly mention some of the most important ones and invite you to further explore them, as well as many others on your own. This list is not exhaustive. They include the following. In the year 1662, the colony of Virginia, using the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, proclaimed that children in the colony were born into their mother's social status. Thus, children born to enslaved mothers were classified as slaves, regardless of their father's ethnicity or status. This was in marked contrast to English common law, which held that children took their father's social status. This principle was later adopted in other slave states. And by the way, when the 13 colonies first existed, slavery was essentially permeated essentially all of those colonies, including here in Pennsylvania. Next to the year 1776 to 1783, the American Revolution occurs, where thousands of slaves in the South escaped to the British, who freed them to fight against the rebellious colonists. When the British lost the war, they relocated thousands of freed slaves to Canada and to their West Indian possessions. In the year 1807, the United States Congress passes the act prohibiting importation of slaves, making it a federal crime to import slaves from abroad. The year 1857 saw the Dred Scott versus Sanford United States Supreme Court decision, whereby slaves were not considered U.S. citizens and thereby could be returned to their masters. Shortly thereafter, in the years 1861 through 1865, the Civil War begins in 1861 and ends in 1865, which helps to effect the abolishment of slavery and involuntary servitude. During that war, in the year 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation takes effect on January 1st, which freed slaves in the rebellious Confederate States. The years 1865 to 1870, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, what are known as the Reconstruction Amendments, abolish slavery and involuntary servitude, guarantee due process of law and equal protection of the law, and citizenship for all U.S. citizens, including African Americans or Blacks. Next, we'll segue to year 1896 and the landmark decision of Pleas versus Ferguson, where the U.S. Supreme Court upheld de jure racial segregation of separate but equal facilities. Of course, that was a myth at the time. Next, in the year 1925, started the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, also known as the New Negro Movement, and I'll discuss that a little later in my presentation. In the year 1954, it was another landmark decision of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, and Baldwin v. Sharp, U.S. Supreme Court cases overturning Plessy v. Ferguson and de jure segregation based upon the concept of separate but equal. In 1964, a banner year in this whole history, the United States Congress passes the Civil Rights Act, which bans discrimination based upon 5 factors: race, color, religion, sex, and natural origin. Shortly thereafter, in 1965, Malcolm X and the Voting Rights Act, Malcolm X was assassinated, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibits racial discrimination in voting. In the year 1968, witnessed the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee. In 1978 came another landmark decision, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, known as the Bakke case. It was a U.S. Supreme Court case which upholds affirmative action in college admissions. Thereafter, in 2003, was another landmark decision of Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger, U.S. Supreme Court cases which uphold affirmative action in college admissions based upon the consideration of race and other factors, but place certain limitations on the use of affirmative action in college admissions. Finally, in 2008, Barack Obama was elected as the 44th United States president, who was the first Black president, which prompts some to claim that America is entering a post-racial era. Given the aforesaid history, I shall now turn my attention to the Harlem Renaissance and how it played a role in Baldwin's life and times. James Baldwin was, as Mr. Robinson said, was born in 1924 on the eve of the Harlem Renaissance. And that Renaissance was an intellectual and cultural revival of African-American expression in many genres, including literature, art, music, theater, politics, scholarship, etc. Many of its writers and thinkers became famous and addressed the Negro problem, including Alain Locke, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and Zora Neale Hurston. They, along with W.E.B. Du Bois and many others, belong to an African-American literary tradition that includes David Walker, Frederick Douglass, and Booker T. Washington. Baldwin, along with Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and others, became later members of that tradition and likewise wrote about the Negro problem. To update that list would also include Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and others. Baldwin was particularly influenced by his contemporary, Richard Wright. Therefore, he was not a singular voice in a literary vacuum, but one who inherited the torch of illuminating the problem of racism and exclusion in America from the likes of his aforesaid predecessors and contemporaries. He was not an accident. The Renaissance was indeed a crucible for African Americans to express their claims for full citizenship and full entry into American society, and to dispel the erroneous notions, lies, and beliefs about their abilities to contribute to the advancement of America in all of its societal guises. Baldwin certainly embraced and upheld its tenets. In my opinion, the Harlem Renaissance was directly responsible for his development and for his keen awareness of how Black people had for decades decried American racism and mistreatment of them. Next, I shall discuss the gist of my presentation today. That is James Baldwin and the law. Throughout his career, James Baldwin wrote and spoke about America's laws and his system of jurisprudence and justice, particularly related to race, discrimination, segregation, and racial inequality. He found those laws and systems to be tools of oppression used by white society against African Americans and blunt instruments to preserve white supremacy. He also objected strenuously to the use of police, juries, and prisons to uphold the American legal system against his people. Thus, his disdain for that system permeates his works, such as Go Tell It on the Mountain, Giovanni's Room, The Fire Next Time, Nobody Knows My Name, Another Country, and Notes of a Native Son. Many of those works contain his main character's victimization by the law and the justice system, and those works are replete with courtroom and prison scenes. In that vein, he became a part of the incarceration experience of many African American and other writers that formed a whole genre of literature. He shared kinship with them. Chief proponents of that genre include him, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Eldridge Cleaver, Angela Davis, and even John Janelle, and others who at some period in their lives experienced incarceration and the overarching power of the law to confine them. Interestingly, that genre has many facets and aligns in many ways with the pivotal theme of existentialism in 20th century writing. As to Baldwin's incarceration experience, he had a lasting encounter with the law in December of 1949, shortly after his arrival in France and becoming an American expatriate, when he was falsely accused of receiving stolen property, in this case, a sheet, and arrested in Paris, France. He spent 8 days in jail before being acquitted. Ironically, Baldwin had recently emigrated to France and Paris, the city of light, to escape racial discrimination in the United States and to write objectively from a distance. In his mind and that of many other American expatriates of color, France, unlike America, epitomized racial tolerance and intellectual freedom of expression. He later found that not to be entirely the case. That unfortunate episode left an indelible and lifelong impression on him and formed the core of his condemnation of the law's power to subjugate individuals and to preserve societal hierarchies, a theme pervasive in his writings. He wrote about the episode in an early essay entitled Equal in Paris. Traumatized by that experience, Baldwin attempted suicide, but failed. Thereafter, he repeatedly wrote about the dehumanizing effects of incarceration and how it has been used by the American justice system to disproportionately keep African Americans in prison and to break their spirits over racial injustice. An informative and very competent treatment of Baldwin and his thoughts and pronouncements on the American legal system can be found in D. Quentin Miller's comprehensive work entitled A Criminal Power, James Baldwin and the Law, published in 2012. Baldwin concentrated on a thorough examination of the law's power to affect the lives of African Americans and the socially disenfranchised. As D. Quentin Miller observes in Criminal Power, quote, Baldwin's response to the law and to the forces that shape it is a lifelong journey that develops from fear to outrage and ultimately into a sense of autonomy, transcendence above the law's force, and the empowerment through the development of a voice that blends the sensibility of a literary artist with the authoritative rhetoric of a lawyer, unquote. For Baldwin, the law provided the authority for those in power to sustain their privileged position and to oppose those who did not have it, such as the poor, minorities, immigrants, homosexuals, the artists, etc. In that regard, such oppressed people were often the victims and heroes of his work, those who were often legal outcasts. They are also the victims of police brutality, which is another manifestation of the law's power. As an openly gay man, Baldwin faced another form of discrimination based upon sexual orientation. He fought throughout his life against the law and society's oppressions of gay people. He firmly believed and espoused that people should be free to love whomever else they choose to love without societal and legal constraint. In that vein, he observed and condemned in his works such as Giovanni's Rome, the law and society's misuse of authority to suppress sexual equality. Through his negative experience with the law and religion, Baldwin eventually rejected both and came to realize that both were designed to uphold the status quo and to suppress individual liberty and expression, as indicated in some of his early works, such as Go Tell It on the Mountain, The Amen Corner, and The Fire Next Time. He gradually came to the realization that American law was generally not meant to protect African Americans, but to persecute them. Also, he came to recognize what he deemed to be two systems of law at work in society. Those systems are actual laws and, quote, hidden laws that often work with and against each other. As an example, America passed anti-discrimination laws, which were largely weakened by the hidden law of human interaction and subterfuge. Another example is the failure of the Brown decision to produce equality in America and to eradicate segregation, something that it failed to do largely because of opposition to it, hidden opposition in many ways. Baldwin was conscious of the law on many levels, including the historical, cultural, dramatic, and personal. Out of that consciousness evolved his fervent belief that the law is a manifestation of criminal power. I'll repeat, the law is a manifestation of criminal power in its ability to label people as criminals and to act criminally without legal repercussion. In his view, that power is often manifested by those who operate above the law, and they are often representatives of it, such as police officers and politicians. And in that way, the law becomes a flawed conceit that reinforces the existing social hierarchy more than it promotes justice. In his worldview, justice is not blind in its horrible mistreatment of African Americans and the poor, a mistreatment that is truly criminal in nature. Baldwin regarded the law as the very substance of white power. He recognized that a society plagued by prejudice is destined to produce a prejudiced legal and judicial system. As to that system, he wrote in his work, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, that the history and situation of Black people in this country amounts to an indictment of America's legal and moral history. Baldwin's growing self-awareness and desire to confront the racial problems in America prompted him to return to his native country from France and to become involved in the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1970s, as Mr. Robinson spoke on. He realized that the law in enlightened France was also used as a force of repression. Although he did not consider himself to be a Black leader, he became a champion for civil rights and worked with Dr. King, Malcolm X, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis, and many others in the movement. He toured the South and witnessed segregation and wrote about it. Regarding desegregation, he observed in his work, Just Above My Head, that America had the gall, quote, the gall to claim to be giving us, African Americans, something they didn't ever have the right to take away, unquote. He also opined that ignorance and apathy are, quote, the price we pay for segregation. That's what segregation means. You don't know what is happening on the other side of the wall because you don't want to know, unquote. Baldwin also believed that civil rights laws had only a limited effect on the lives of his people, but preferred it to the type of action that could result in the brutal enforcement of the law against them. Disillusioned and frightened by the deaths of Dr. King and Malcolm X, Baldwin returned to the foreign exile in the late 1960s and resided mainly in Turkey and France. There he returned to an examination of the law and what he deemed its most brutal symbols, prison and the police. In the final 2 decades of his life, Baldwin's concern with the law's power and misuse reached its fullest expression as shown in his works, If Beale Street Could Talk and Evidence of Things Not Seen. They exhibit a growth of his perspective from a terrified man, as it was in Equal in Paris, to one who overcame his fear of the law's power and criminality, and one who learned to deal with the law on his own terms and to overcome it with patience. With his change of perspective on the force and utility of the law, he observed in Blues from Mr. Charlie that, quote, that we are walking in terrible darkness here, and this one man's attempt to bear witness to the reality and power of light. This brings me to my conclusion. Baldwin's perceptions of race, rights, and his re-encounter with light continue to be relevant today, given the, quote, great pushback in America against the movement for human rights, equal justice, and societal plurality. We must dispel the illusionary belief espoused by some that we live in a post-racial America. We do not. In that regard, he was truly an observer, prophet, and alarmist of American society's social, moral, political, military, and legal misdeeds and decay, who challenged our complacency. He spoke of, quote, change not on the surface, but in the depth, change in the sense of renewal, unquote. He passionately believed in and fought for the salvation of the oppressor because he realized that in oppressing others, ironically, the oppressor likewise oppresses himself and loses his humanity, a phenomenon likewise observed by Dr. King and many others. In that regard, he noted that, quote, we must fight for your life as though it were our own, which it is, unquote. Thus, he was not a complete nihilist in his assessment of the law, and he had matured in his beliefs as to overcoming of the misuse of the law and the American power system with patience and understanding. In closing, I note this passage on Baldwin by the celebrated African-American author and thinker, John Henrik Clarke, in his The Alienation of James Baldwin. Quote, a lot of people are hearing Baldwin's words, but missing his message. What the Negro wants is justice, not sympathy. And if justice is not forthcoming, there may well be the fire the next time, and sooner than you think. That ends my presentation. Once again, I thank Widener Law School for the ability to talk with you this morning. So I defer to the Dean. I believe for any questions or discussion you may have of what Mr. Robinson and I presented today.
I'd like to thank Mr. Robinson and Mr. Cooper for their remarks. Now we have a little time for questions and answers. If anyone here in the audience or anyone online would like to share those with us. Yes, sir. So the question is, how as law students and lawyers can we work toward removing the de facto segregation that still exists? Either one.
I'll give a short answer as a layperson, and then I'm sure Sam will chime in as a legal jurist himself. But certainly it requires, I believe, an understanding of the law, the history of the law. And I know Sam went to great detail to share that. That's important. A lot of times we think that that our current existence is all that's where we are today is where the world has always been. And so you have to have an appreciation for this long sweep of history. And so as legal minds, young jurists are looking at law, how can I turn the system around? You have to have an appreciation for what was the context of that law when it was created and dissect that and then very deliberately be about the business of looking at it today in its relevant terms and recognizing the context in which some of those laws were created. And so that's how I believe you can, by becoming a student, literally a student of the law, to understand its origin and then look to dismantle it and dissect it and move forward from there and build upon what you saw then was the mores of that day when that law was created versus where we are today, and begin to see how you can make that transition. That's what I would say as a layperson. Brother Sam may have some additional comments to that question, but thank you for that question.
Yes, I do, and I hope all can hear me, and thank you for that question. I think it's a great question. I firmly echo Mr. Robinson's comments and his suggestions. We lawyers and we who hope to be lawyers really must know our history. Our legal history, as Mr. Robinson said, the development of the law. And in my opinion, our law schools don't emphasize enough the history of the law and studying that history. It also means studying the history of this country and studying the history of Blacks and other minorities in this country and knowing American history. Unfortunately, so many of us Americans do not know that history and how things came to be today. That history will tell us that. So you as a law student can start with learning American history, as much of it as you possibly can, and how the law has functioned within that history and all. That will tell you many things. It will help to change perspectives that we have on what America really truly means. It dispels the myth that we are the sole beacon of light in this world and all. We need to see America in all of its guises and twists and turns and all. That will help us to come to a healthy understanding of who we are and hopefully provide the grounds for a truly dialogue and discourse on race. We need to have that conversation with one another. And hopefully then, once we know the truth of the matter, that will help us to continue to devise new truths that will include inclusion and equity for all of us.
Thank you. Other questions? I don't see anything in the chat either. All right, well, we have a 15-minute break scheduled, so we will resume at 1:45.
I don't need it.
Yep, good.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay. Hi, how are you? It's great to know people, huh?
Well, Michelle just moved here from Boise too.
Oh my gosh. Oh gosh, small world. Isn't it?
Very. Walking buddies.
All right. Okay, we're going to get ready to get started again. If everyone please take their seats. Thank you very much as we continue this exciting program today. This is panel 2, and I have the great honor and privilege of introducing our 2 panelists for part 2 of this. And as we did in the first part, we're going to hear, after I introduce the panelists, we will have a short video clip. We'll get reactions from our two panelists. And then, of course, as we have time, we'll have questions from the audience. So it's my great honor and privilege. Well, first of all, it's great to be back home. I'm a graduate of Widener Commonwealth many years ago, but it's great, as always, to be back home. So I'm going to start with the panelists on my left over here, Ms. Shaakirah R. Sanders, who has recently joined the Penn State Dickinson School of Law as a visiting professor. Prior to joining Dickinson Law, Professor Sanders was the first African-American and second person of color to achieve the rank of full professor at the University of Idaho College of Law, which was done in 2018. She teaches courses related to U.S. constitutional law and criminal procedure. She's previously coached or co-coached the national moot competition teams in Boise and in Moscow. I guess that's Idaho. She serves as a faculty advisor for the ACLU and student law groups at Idaho. And she served as a faculty advisor for the Idaho Critical Legal Studies Journal and the Public Interest Law Group. And as we were talking, she was telling me she's a former public defender. She's also published many articles, particularly on felony sentencing reforms, civil and criminal jury trial rights, religious freedom, agriculture security, and ag-gag legislation. Many of them, I commend them to you in the bio because they sound very interesting. I'm going to read a few of them. She regularly gives CLE University and public service presentations, and on occasion, she's testified before the Idaho legislature. She's appeared in various news stories in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Associated Press, and Al Jazeera America. She has also provided legal commentary for Excited Utterance. All of us know what that is, the Evidence Law and Proof podcasts, as well as many local and regional television broadcasts and publications. She was a judicial law clerk for the Honorable Ivan L. Lemel in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Louisiana, and the Honorable Levinsky R. Smith, who is the current Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit. She's practiced in Seattle, Washington, at K&L Gates, and of course, she was a public defender. And she also practiced in New Orleans, Louisiana. She also serves as a board officer for the ACLU of Idaho and the Richard C. Fields American Inns of Court. So welcome, Professor Saunders. Our next distinguished guest is Ms. Janelle L. West, and who currently serves Widener University as its Dean of Graduate and Continuing Studies. She received her BS degree from Cheney, her MPA from Penn State, and her ED from Widener. Her scholarship continues to center on college choice and enrollment patterns at historically Black colleges and universities, contemporary approaches to address challenges facing those HBCUs, particularly around enrollment, and experiences of the Black woman in higher education through critical qualitative inquiry. Her work has drawn attention of publications such as Diverse Issues in Education and Higher Education, MSI's Unplugged, the HBCU Times, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times. Dr. West is a NADA Catalyst Grant recipient, a University Professional and Continuing Education Association Scholarship recipient, and a Widener Provost Faculty Development Awardee. So welcome both of our distinguished panelists. And now we will have Brian put on the clip for this segment.
What a funny question. My mind is someplace else, really. But to think back on it, I was born in Harlem Hospital, you know, and we grew up, the first house I remember was on Park Avenue, which is not the American Park Avenue, or maybe it is the American Park Avenue.
Uptown Park Avenue. Uptown
Park Avenue, where the railroad tracks are. And we used to play on the roof and in the, I can't call it an alley, but near the river. It was a kind of dump, garbage dump. And that was the first, those were the first scenes I remember. I remember my father had trouble keeping us alive. There were 9 of us. And I was the oldest, so I took care of the kids and dealt with Daddy, whom I understand much better now. Part of his problem was he couldn't feed his kids. But I was a kid and I didn't know that. And he was very religious, very rigid. He kept us together, I must say. And when I look back on it, after all, it was nearly 40 years ago that I was born, I think back of on my growing up and walk that same block today because it's still there. And think of the kids on that block now. I'm aware that something terrible has happened, which is very hard to describe. I am in all but no technical legal fact a Southerner. My father was born in the South. No, my mother was born in the South. And if they had waited, 2 more seconds, I might have been born in the South. But that means that I was raised by a family whose roots were essentially rural and
Southern
rural, and whose relationship to the church was very direct because it was the only means they had of expressing their pain and their despair. But 20 years later, the moral authority which was present in the Negro Northern community when I was growing up has vanished. And people talk about progress, and I look at Harlem, which I really know. I know it like I know my hand. And it is much worse there today than it was when I was growing up.
Would you say this is true of the schools too?
It's much worse in the schools.
What school did you go to?
I went to PS 24, went to PS 139.
139. We are fellow alumni. I went to 139. And
I didn't like a lot of my teachers, but I had a couple of teachers who were very nice to me. One was a Negro teacher. And I remember, you asked me these questions, so I'm trying to answer you. I remember coming home from school, and you can guess how young I must have been. And my mother asked me if my teacher was colored or white. And I said she was a little bit colored, a little bit white, but because she was about your color. And as a matter of fact, I was right. That's part of the dilemma of being an American Negro, that one is a little bit colored and a little bit white. And not only in physical terms, but in the head and in the heart. And there are days, this is one of them, when you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it. How precisely you're going to reconcile yourself to your situation here, and how you're going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here. And to be here means that you can't be anywhere else. I could, in my own person, leave this country, and I could go to Africa, I could go to China, I could go to Russia, I could go to Cuba, but I'm an American. That is a fact.
Yes, Jim?
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to join you here this morning.
on this wonderful program reflecting on James Baldwin, race, rights, and the U.S. Constitution. My name is Shaakirah Sanders. I am a visiting professor of law at Penn State Dickinson Law, just across the river and down the road from here. As you heard, my home institution is the University of Idaho College of Law. I teach constitutional law, criminal procedure, and the First Amendment. My mom was one of the hugest James Baldwin fans I have ever known. And so when I saw the idea for this program, it really filled me with so much joy, so many wonderful memories that at the time seemed torturous as a kid. But now, as I am a fully, growing adult, it is amazing to me that despite the length of time since he's spoken many of the words, written many of his words, they still resonate with me, and I connect to them as a legal professional. And there was one of his YouTube videos on the interwebs, as I like to say, really kind of caught me, one of his phrases. And he talks about, here he says, the future of the Negro in this country is precisely as bright or as dark as the future of the country. He says what, in his original words, were what whites need, but I sort of amended this a little bit, being the lawyer that I am, and said what Americans need to do is find out why it was necessary to have it in IGGER in the first place. He concludes or continues that the future of the country depends on that. So I think we all have a sense, right? This is a room full of lawyers, potential lawyers. I think I heard some Your Honors when I walked in here. We're all very well aware of why it was necessary for this country to create categories of individuals who did not enjoy the same status or rights as others. And as we think about the broadness of American legal history, we know that the creation of these other categories was not just a matter of our founding and the needs at that time. But this is a matter of what African Americans and people of color, and women, sexual minorities, religious minorities, right? What we continue to experience in the law. And for me, this is not just a legal matter. For those who have chosen this most noble of professions, what you can find yourself is either experiencing or watching your clients experience what can be emotional, spiritual, and even a professional type of torture that comes with being othered in that way. So let's talk about, right, what we know, however, with regards to this need to otherize individuals. So I always love the preamble of the Constitution, right? This goal to ensure domestic tranquility, in particular, securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. I am not an originalist, but I do play one in my scholarship. And you'd be very curious to find, I'm always curious, what does these words mean? And not so much what these words mean, how did we achieve our goals of assuring domestic tranquility and securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves, and who are the our, right? And who are the our posterities that we are talking about. Now, what's interesting to me when you look at the original founding documents, the original 7 articles and the Bill of Rights, the 10 Bill of Rights that we have, it seems to me that there's sort of a gap between the reality of this new country and what these documents say. And of course, we know that that gap is caused by race. And the secret ingredient of race that is key to this new system of economic exploitations our founders created. And I say secret because while it was a huge open secret in the streets of the 1700s, if you look at the actual Constitution, however, other than the term referring to Native Americans, you do not see any conversation about race or anything that specifically says, right? Yes, we're going to have the system of slavery. It is a right. Only, however, if it is African-American people, right? There's no African-Americans are the slave clause in our Constitution. And this is pretty clear when you look into these 7 original articles. The one that creates the most distinctions would be Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, talking about voting rights. It includes freed people, those who are bound to service for a term of years. It expressly excludes Indians not taxed, and 3/5 of all other persons. Now, other than this use of this term Indian here, right? We don't really quite, if you're just looking at someone who just fell out of the sky in the 1700s, there would be no way for you to know, right, that you can't take any old person and drag them into any category that you want. Now, as far as race, again, the most we see is the term Indians in these original articles. So we see it again in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. If you go to Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, here we don't see any explicit mention of slavery itself, Black people, African Americans. We do know, right, that there's some aspect of migration and importation that the states are in charge of, right? But not really quite explicit, again, if you don't really know this new culture, who quite it is that falls into these different categories. And of course, we have other provisions that kind of allude to the fact that we're protecting certain relationships. A lot of interesting scholarship on the role of the contracts clause at the original founding pre and after the Civil War. Of course, there's the clause about escaped persons, right? No clear racial designation about who these escaped persons are, but we know who we are talking about with regards to all of these. And of course, we have our wonderful Bill of Rights that sort of protects this new system of other rising people, right? Really for the government to go in and confiscate your property about the treating your human property because of so many protections. One of my favorite is the Third Amendment, right? That prevents you from having to quarters in your home. I always tell my students, it's still unincorporated. When you get out, you find a case, call up Professor Sanders. I will work that case with you. We will get all our fees. This is a home run, right? But think about the way in which all of our Bill of Rights protected certain things, some and others, thus creating the system of caste. And of course, we can't just sort of look to then our founding documents. We have to look to the case law that was decided. Very interesting the way in which in those original founding years, the court looked at a number of cases about the rights of tribal people, about the rights of enslaved people, making it very clear that there are different rules for some based on the color of their skin or perceptions about the color of skin. Of course, even after we had our Civil War amendments that did a lot of things, the first of which is to finally acknowledge slavery by name. And at least with regards to the 15th Amendment, acknowledge race and a connection between race, citizenship, color that existed under our Constitution. Of course, we know the 15th Amendment, it was not a complete abolishment of the system of slavery and involuntary servitude. There were some caveats that our second framers decided to put on those provisions. And of course, we know what those caveats eventually led to. But our case law still sort of perpetuated this idea that we need categories of people. And a lot of this, of course, was for economic gain. Interesting contrast, I think, between some of those post-Civil War cases, looking at Pleas versus Ozawa, two individuals who make a very similar claim that they should enjoy the privileges of being white. Mr. Plessy's argument was that I'm 7/8 white and therefore I should get to sit in a certain part of the train car. Lots of arguments about how that is probably a First Amendment argument about free expression, but we see it as a case about race. Interesting there that the court did not decide or question or even dig into whether Mr. Plessy's claim about his race was legally true or legally untrue. The court just lumps them into the category of African Americans. Court doesn't even really dig into how is it that this train conductor has the skill and know how to detect the 1/8 white in Mr. Plessy's blood and thus remove him from the white section of the train car. But in Ozawa, we had an individual who made the claim that their Japanese descent categorized them as white, and thus they were able to migrate to the country and enjoy the privileges of citizenship. There, the court takes the time to let him know what whiteness means, to address his claims of being white. Now, of course, the court rejects his inclusion into that category and makes it clear that individuals of his descent can never enjoy the privileges given under this federal statute. But the court at least considers, hey, we're going to decide that you are not, in fact, white. Unlike Mr. Plessy, where we are not really going to entertain this question. We see these distinctions continue in other bodies of case law about who's allowed to testify in court. Decades of cases saying that African Americans and other people cannot testify. You had different categories of individuals challenging whether those laws apply to them based on their descent. Another famous case involving an Asian plaintiff. Now, I want to wrap up here by thinking about this time, right? Right around this, in the years after Ozawa, James Baldwin is born. We know all that he is able to achieve. I think a lot about the cases that were decided during his lifetime, the cases that were not touched, right? Cases on lynching, right? These are not things the Supreme Court wanted to hear. These issues, when you ever listen to James Baldwin speak about the fear that he lived in, this is the type of behavior that he is explicitly referencing. But we did see cases on internment of individuals based on their race, striking down of racial covenants, formal segregation in schools, the upholding of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Loving versus Virginia. Even during Baldwin's lifetime, we had a temporary reprieve on capital punishment, explicitly on the basis of race. There's another case that lasted during Mr. Baldwin's lifetime that I think was something that he would have been thinking a lot about. And this is a case out of New York. It's a US Supreme Court case. You might have read it in your criminal law class or procedure class or sentencing class. This is a case that holds that judicial discretion to consider sentencing information that had not been cross-examined at a trial existed. In fact, the court formally constitutionalizes judicial discretion. Now, Mr. Williams was accused of a murder in 1947, New York, where Mr. Baldwin was from, was probably living there at the time. This is a case out of Brooklyn. Mr. Williams maintained his innocence and alleged that he was abused until he confessed to the murder. There was one witness to the murder, the victim's younger brother, who said the murderer was a white man. Mr. Williams was an 18-year-old African-American, disabled male, disabled due to his service in the military. He is convicted of his crime by an all-white male jury who laughs when he gives his testimony about the abuse he suffered that led to his confession. His sentence is upheld by the Supreme Court on the theory that judges always exercise this discretion, even back in the founding in the English common law, which tons of scholarship has disabused since then. The court also upheld the sentence on the theory that we can trust judges to make the right calls at sentencing. At Mr. Williams's sentencing, the judge shifted the jury's life sentence to a sentence of death, based on 30 unsubstantiated reports that Mr. Williams was a burglar, that he attempted to molest young white girls, and that he was a menace to society. An exact quote. Turns out, however, after Mr. Williams's life sentence was upheld, the governor of New York commuted it back to life, saying, and I quote, "We do not know if he's the murderer." He spends 15 years in jail. He is ultimately released on a habeas corpus in the 1960s. In the 1970s, he is successful in his civil jury for damages for malicious prosecution and false imprisonment. Interesting that we begin debating guidelines right when he wins his civil judgment. And yet, despite all of this negative history that you can Google and find, thank you, Google, you changed my scholarship on this. This is one of the most cited cases in criminal law for the rule that judges can look at outside evidence at sentencing. This case is cited hundreds of times a year, despite the fact that we could not trust the judge in Mr. Williams's case. We have this constitutionalized rule that is very clearly created to hide the underlying racism in Mr. Williams' case, because this murder case was widely reported for 30 years. From the minute this young girl was killed, this case was widely supported. Now, I'm not saying they didn't read newspapers back then, but it wasn't a lot to read. There was no internet. I'm pretty sure they were checking the New York Times. And the first thing we learned in the Williams decision is that the facts of the case do not matter, so the court will not discuss them. So I think about this world that Mr. Baldwin lived in. I think about the arc of incorporation of criminal procedure rights after the US Supreme Court's decision in this case. The arc of the new sentencing scheme after what happened in his case was revealed in federal court. I think about how much Mr. Williams' story still resonates today. And when I think about these things, I know why we needed to create the other. But I am so grateful to have had the opportunities to do this for a living, right? Literally Google some dude's name because I was procrastinating on my scholarship, finding the treasure trove of newspaper articles, falling in love with Mr. Williams. This is the only picture I've ever been able to find of him. He my boo now. I don't know how old he is, but I'm gonna find him. And advocating his story. So for all of you students who were sitting there like I was 20 plus years ago, wondering, what am I gonna do with this law degree? I'm only 26. You will find it. I remember reading this case in law school. I remember citing to this case in judicions in federal district court on the 8th Circuit with no idea of any of this underlying history. I was the Booker clerk, if you know the Booker case, in the 8th Circuit. We did not sentence for 6 months because of that case. And when we did, we just went right back to Williams. Judge got discretion. Think about the foundations of our law. If you practice criminal law, never cite this case in your briefs. And thank you again for inviting me here to be with you today.
Thank you. I'm just gonna leave this picture up, if you don't mind. Hold this up a little bit more. So good morning, everyone. Good morning. I am excited to be here for a lot of reasons. Some that Professor Saunders expressed as well. So when I first received the topic that we were going to talk about James Baldwin, it was something that was very near and dear to my heart because it was very near and dear to my father's heart. And so that kind of led the discussion that I want to have, and kind of is going to lead the talk that I'll have with you this morning. So I just want to get a little more comfortable because I feel like I'm leaning into I'm leaning into the mic. But so I guess I'm going to take a step back and to talk a little bit about a journey or a path that I've had in my life and how I got here, but also how Baldwin, his writings and his teachings have impacted my life. So when I was thinking about what I wanted to say to the students and to this audience this morning, I had a lot of thoughts. I had a lot of thoughts about my family, my mother, my father, my grandmother, and their journeys. And I thought, how could I frame this talk? Where could I go? I'm not a lawyer, even though in my heart I think I am sometimes. I haven't studied law. So, I read a lot. I consider myself to be a historian. I'm a sociologist. So I said, where can I go with this? What can I add? What value do I add? And so I started with the 13th Amendment, right? And I started with 1865 and the end of slavery. And so thought about that. I thought about the generations in my family, and I thought about what came next. And what came next is 1964, right? And so the Civil Rights Act. So between 1865 and 1964, I thought to myself, what transpired in my family? My grandmother was born in 1920. My mother was born in 1955. And so I often watch movies, I read books to kind of figure out what their life was like during that time, because it was very different from mine. My father, born 2 years before this case, which is why I asked. My maiden name was Williams. So I was like, I've never heard of this case. So now I'm very, very interested to look it up. But my father was born 1947. And so I think about these dates and what their life looked like and how that's not too far in the past, right? In the ways that we think about things. And so it rang true to me, even in preparing this conversation, because when I was preparing, I was watching the videos. I have two sons, 10 and 16. And my 16-year-old asks, who is that? Who is this man? I'm taken aback because I know who this man is. I'm like, how don't you know who this man is? And so it's like, I don't know. Have I failed as a parent? Is education failing? And so now we have this dialogue, right? So I tell him who James Baldwin is. I tell him why I'm doing it. And so not to go overboard or too deep into who Baldwin was and in that moment, just to make it a teachable moment, I said, we're going to have a family movie night, in which we did. And so we watched a documentary called I Am Not Your Negro, which I thought was age appropriate for him. And my 10-year-old, we watched that. And I watched their reactions to this film. And one of the reactions was, wow, when did this happen? How did this happen? Are we Black? Are we Black people? Are we Negroes? I'm just like totally aghast, because in this way, I realized their privilege. I realized the privilege that they have, but also the innocence that they have. So back to my timeline. So 1865, 1964, right? So I think about my timeline, and a lot of people don't know, so I'm from Philadelphia. I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up in the Philadelphia education system. And by and large, most of these are segregated for various reasons, one of which is redlining, I'm sure you know about. And so I think about my life in Philadelphia. And in 1989, I remember I was one of 12 Black students that integrated my elementary school. And so when I think about that, and when I tell people that, they look at me like, wow, you integrated your elementary school. And I say, I did. And I remember my mom purposely moving into Northeast Philadelphia so I could go to a certain elementary school. And I remember feeling ashamed and embarrassed because my mom, she picketed for students, for integration, for students to be able to be bused into Northeast Philadelphia for Black students to go to school there. And I remember not necessarily understanding fully what her sacrifice meant, not understanding fully why, and not understanding fully why she had to present herself in this way in full scope of my friends, of my white friends, of my white school. But in this way, like Baldwin said in the clip, you're a little bit white, you're a little bit Black, right? And so not necessarily by skin color, but what I saw. I was one of 12 Black students, so I didn't necessarily see myself as Black per se. I didn't necessarily see color until in the 3rd grade. Integration was still in its early stages in Philadelphia. Constance Clayton was the superintendent at that time, whose policy it was to integrate Philadelphia schools. But I remember being in a schoolyard, still very young, naive, just like my children. And there was a fight. There was a fight in the schoolyard, and there was a chant that went like this: fight, fight, a Negro and a white. And I remember thinking, like, oh, it's a catchy song. So I'll go home, I sing the song. And my mom is kind of like, what are you saying? Just like kind of grip me up, like, you don't say these things. And so now, I don't know, like this is the song in the schoolyard. And so this is my introduction to race in America, right? And so fast forward, backtrack to now my sons. I'm doing the same thing. I remember this is when my father took it upon himself to instill in me Black history. I feel like after that summer, I had to read every book on history. I had to watch every movie. I watched Roots. I read Roots. I watched any and everything that had to do with anything about Black history and what I needed to know about myself. And so in that way, in some ways, I take it for granted that as an educator, I assume that my children will know. But creating and doing this presentation, I realized the privilege that they have. But is it a privilege, right? Because again, as we watched I Am Not Your Negro, I watched their reactions and I listened to their questions. And so there's a quote that Baldwin says, to be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be enraged almost all of the time. And I saw that as my children in 2023 recognized who they were and what their station was based upon race and skin color, who they would be and how they're going to grow up. So that's where I'll start. This is where I'll start the conversation and thinking about that, right? So they asked me a question after the movie was over and said, is race or any race superior? So I took a deep breath to try to figure out, how do I answer this question? What do I say to a 10 and 16-year-old? And so my household, we're a Christian household, we read the Bible. And so a scripture that I'll read to you is from Acts 17:26, which it says, God made out of one man every nation of men to dwell on the entire surface of the earth, right? And so I took this scripture and I asked them, what does that mean to you? And they said that everyone is equal, right? If God made us to be equal, we should be equal. I said, you're not wrong. And so then I think about James Baldwin and his speech that he delivered in 1963, The Negro and the American Promise. And so what is that promise? So we have a promise from God, all right? And so we have this American promise. We're Negro, Black, African-American, depending on the year. Like, what does that look like to us? And so we had this conversation. And I couldn't help but to think about, again, their privilege and where their station is in life. I think about my mom and how, though slavery ended in 1865, or at least there was an amendment, but the behaviors change. Same way, she was born in 1955 and Civil Rights Act passed. 1964, the behaviors changed. Was she immediately accepted? Because it wouldn't be until 1989 that her daughter will go to school and integrate her elementary school. It wouldn't be until 2023 that her grandsons have access to a multitude of things because their mother is a doctor. I think about my grandmother in 1920, a story I just heard recently, actually, that I didn't know, but also doing research and just thinking about my own privilege and my path. and the sacrifices that my parents made, that in 1940, backtrack, my grandmother had 9 children. My grandparents were married for 63 years, 9 children. My mother was the baby of those children. So what I just found out is that, or though I knew, I didn't understand the nuance of the experiences. So I understand Jim Crow laws, Jim Crow South. My family and my father's from Louisiana. My mother's from Georgia. So essentially the South. They came to Philadelphia. My grandfather was a Marine. My father was a Marine. They settled in Philadelphia. But what I found out, which I flabbergasted, is that in 1940s, it was illegal for a Black child to go to a white dentist. And though I knew that, and though I knew there was Jim Crow laws and separation and segregation, it just didn't occur to me, probably in the same way that it didn't occur to my children that their mother integrated her elementary school. And so if you couldn't go to a Black dentist, or you couldn't go to a white dentist, where could you go? And for children in segregation, they had to go to the veterinarian. And so think about the indignation of having to lower yourself to go to the vet to get your teeth cleaned, right? And so I think about these things. And so again, we fast forward, we ask ourselves, reflecting upon race and rights in America and where we are today. I stand in this room as a doctor surrounded by lawyers, judges, administrators, people of color, who in some ways we can say we have arrived, but have we? Are we free? I think about a quote from Baldwin that says, he thinks about, when are parents still able to watch their children grow up and not worry that they'll reach 30, right? So my son is 16, 15 years, he'll be 30, hopefully. And the reason I say hopefully is because, again, thinking about their privilege, my privilege, I took my sons to Disney this past November. It's a very expensive trip, but they wanted to go to Disney. So we went to Disney. We're in Florida. And it didn't occur to me until we went out to dinner off the grounds, because we stayed on the property, but they wanted to go like into the town, because we do this thing, back to privilege. It has been my goal to take them to all 50 states, right? And so each state that we go to, we find the mural and take a picture at the mural that says greetings from wherever. So we went to dinner by the greetings from Orlando mural. My oldest son, being a teenager, he has this hood on. It's dark. Take your hood off. It's like, why? Take your hood off. We're going back and forth. And in this moment, I'm terrified. My son is 6'3". He does not look like he's 16. Maybe like 220. He's very big. I'm looking up to him. Take your hood off. And so in this way, though, back to Baldwin, even in all my privilege, my accolades, the things that I do, will I be able to protect my sons in America from their race, from racism, from the laws and the discriminations that they will face based on systematic institutional racism, right? This is what I think about. And so how do we combat that? I heard a question earlier and said, how do we as lawyers, or you as future lawyers, address this in our work, right? One, I think you need to recognize and identify that it's there. A question that my youngest son asks is, will racism go away? Right? Will racism go away? How can we make it go away? So I think about, in about 40 years from now, 2064, will there be a new law? Will there be new laws? Will there be amendments? Will there be new cases? What will they look like in 30 years for my sons? In 2064, maybe they'll be at Widener Law. maybe they'll be wherever they want to be, right? So we saw, I think in a clip where it said, you know, if we're good Negroes, maybe you'll be a president, right? We have our first Black female president, vice president in 2023. So just some things to consider. And what I'll conclude on is this. Baldwin asked the question in this clip. It says, what is your role in this country? Right? What is your role in this country as a student, as a future lawyer, as an individual, your intersectionalities, how you identify? I'm like, okay. What is your role in this country? And then ask yourself, what is your future in it? What does your future look like? What does your future look like for your children? How can you make this world better? What is your story? Where have you come from? So I think about mine. Always. My mother, 1955. My father, 1947. My grandmother, 1920. Louisiana, Georgia, now Philadelphia. I'm here. My sons are here. My family is here, and you are here. So I leave you with that, and I'll leave you with one final quote, though I said the last quote was the final one. It's a scripture from Acts. God is not partial. Think about Baldwin. Read, do research, think about your impact and who you are and who you want to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. West. We're going to have some time for questions now. I'd like to start though. Dr. West, you talked a lot about history. And as we know, there's been lots of conversation recently about trying to rewrite certain parts of history. And I wanted to get your take on that if I could.
Okay. I don't think we can rewrite history without first exposing what the history is, right? And so I think there are narratives about what our history is and what it has been. There's different variations of that history, but I think trying to get down to what actually is first before we can think about rewriting what it is what I would believe it to be, what I would think.
I think in some ways the history has already been rewritten. And then it's been rewritten. And now there's an attempt to rewrite the rewrite of the rewrite. And I think that part of the genesis of this is the way in which our framers both were very blatant about what they were doing, but also sort of kind of hiding it in the actual founding documents to create this cloud of confusion for future generations. Now, I don't know if they were brilliant enough to say, hey, let's not be as explicit, right? Because we don't want future Americans to judge us. But I do think that there was a fair amount of shame they must have had to not be as blatant as they could have been to make it clear, because there were multiple lawsuits in that founding era of non-African Americans being forced into labor. And those cases were resolved successfully for those plaintiffs. They got damages. If you took somebody's kid, you could get your kid back. So the reality of it was very clear. And I think that still remains in the United States, right? This both very blatant and explicit part of how race and rights work. But also when you go to the laws, it's often very hidey about how we get to these results. And as someone who teaches common law, that's all in the analysis. The Supreme Court approves that, right? That is the way they prefer you do your discrimination, is facially neutral classifications with a mere discriminatory impact. Those are okay, right? And so to me, it's part of the constitutional ingredients to sort of allow for very neutral laws to have an extremely disparate impact. That's what the Constitution does itself, as I had hoped to point out with sort of showing you the language, right? That's what we've kind of always done. That allows for the changing of the script, the re-changing of the script, the re-changing of the script. But in some ways, it's all the same script to me.
Thank you. Questions from the audience?
Thank you. Yes, first, really want to thank both of you for being vulnerable and sharing your stories. I think a lot of us were definitely moved in hearing about that. I did want to ask about specifically the concept of reparations. I think that as you were speaking, you talk a lot about the privileges that a lot of us have had. And I think, with redlining specifically, a lot of us who have been able to leave the zip codes we were born to had more privileges than our families that we left behind. So I'm very interested in actually the sociological, the academic activism aspect of this, and as well as the legal arguments that can be made for when people say that we're moved past a point where like we can't, make up for the wrongs that have been done. But I think that there are good arguments that say that, that we still need these calls for reparations. I would love to know any insights or works that you have read, that you've worked on, and your opinions on where we go from there.
I think where I start with reparations in the way that I frame it with my research is access. So I start with access. And in my work specifically, I work to look at barriers for entry in academia and how academia is a gateway to achieve a certain place or status in the world that we live in this America, right? And so that's one kite. But then when you think about the historical lens of the denials of certain places and spaces that people of color, marginalized communities can go in, there's individual approaches. And so it's finding an approach, and maybe law is one, and to create different laws or look at policy. So I also have a background in policy. And so when I went to Penn State and studied policy there, and I thought at one point policy and changing of policies would be my kite to create access or open access to remove barriers. Because at the fundamental level, when we think about what shapes and moves this country, it is law and policy. And so that first has to move to provide then access that provides the opportunity. Because just to me, giving a blanket here doesn't give you the equity of understanding how to do it, right? So if you've never, for example, purchased a home, I can give you $1 million today, and maybe you purchase a home and you upkeep it. Can you finance it? Do you know which home to buy? Do you know where to buy it? So there's also an education piece that comes into that. So for me, I think first about access, then I think about what shapes access, and that's policy and law. So that's where I would start in that conversation.
So, I think you need to poo-poo these arguments that you can't do anything about an old wrong. One, law was designed to remedy wrongs. I mean, that's kind of the whole point of law, last I checked, and of course, to establish social order. But there was a case that came out a few years ago under the Takings Clause, where the Supreme Court made very clear that there is no statute of limitations on constitutional law claims. So for me, there is no sort of point in time in which you can't do anything. Now, I think how I've come to think of this as someone who sort of has graduated from law school, not really knowing what I was gonna do other than make some money so I could pay those loans off. I really over time have come to decide that I guess I'm gonna lower my expectations of myself, right? All these things were here before I got here. So obviously my job is not to cure any of it. But it does kind of leave you with, well, what is your job? What is your role in this? And for me, it's really just to take that, whatever steps I can take towards keeping the conversation going, keeping the issue alive, right? Accepting the no's, but never letting a no answer stop me from making the exact same claim, just refining it, right? And understanding that the way law works, people lose arguments for decades, for years, right? For a century before they win. And so for me, because those constitutional-based claims never die, the work that I do for them will never be dead. It can live well beyond my time here. And so when I think about that, it opens an endless possibility of things that I can do because I'm not limiting myself to any sense of success or failure, and more importantly, no time frame on myself. And so now what I do is I try to take care of myself first and foremost, so that I can have the energy and the passion that I like to bring to it. But I also, again, sort of think of myself as a self-reparation body, right? My reparation is not so much the privilege I get from being an attorney or a law professor, or all the other stuff, but the passion that I get from it. The passion that I get to infect my students with almost every day in class, hopefully if I'm doing my job right, right? The passion that I get from talking to other academics, people in the public, people on TV about cases that are interesting. To me, that is what I'm here to do. And I'll just end this by saying, I graduated from law school in 2001. I was still remembering the first week of my federal clerkship when 9/11 happened. And I knew that that was going to change everything about the law and my career. And it did. And so I also think about those events that will happen for you over your life. Sometimes your thing will change because life has changed and you have to sort of shift and respond to that. But thinking about that and sort of the arc and trajectory and the really toughness that I felt through my career, especially as you advance, it seems like things get tougher for some reason. All of those things are also part of what connects me to my history and my past in a way. And so I've come to sort of accept that intersection too. And I've come to appreciate the small bits of knowledge I get from my ancestors when I'm in these really tough situations where I'm isolated, where I'm othered, where I don't feel as if I am getting the same type of courtesy and respect as my colleagues, right? There's just a place of peace that I found with that now that connects me right to the past. And that is something that I've really come to like cherish because it kind of takes me out of the present in a way that can be very helpful for me. Sorry for the long answer. I did say I teach con law, so you can blame it on that.
Well, I think we're at time, and I thank you all for participating, and let's give our two panelists a round of applause.
All right, I'll be back down when you're ready.
You just want me to do it and share it?
That's fine. Yeah, walk on it. You gotta stop it. Gotta stop it. So you want to do that? Or you
I'll
want me to
start
go?
it.
All right.
Stop. How about that?
That works. All right.
Okay, thank you. Let's go ahead and continue with our third session today. We are pleased to have with us the Honorable Royce Morris, who is also our jurist in residence here at Commonwealth Law School. Judge Morris was elected to the Dauphin County Court of Common Pleas in 2017. Prior to his election to the bench, he was a shareholder in the law firm of Goldberg Katzman, where he focused his practice in municipal law as well as in civil and criminal litigation in both state and federal courts. Judge Morris brought over 25 years of experience of practicing law to the bench, during which time he had represented clients in more than 200 trials. His service to the legal community includes a term as president of the Pennsylvania Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys, his work on a Pennsylvania Bar Association committee charged with making recommendations on revisions to the Code of Judicial Conduct, and 4 years on the Pennsylvania Commission on Sentencing. In addition, Judge Morris chaired the Dauphin County Bar Association Equal Professional Opportunity Committee for 7 years. He has also been deeply involved in the community. He continues to serve on the board of directors for the Harrisburg Police Athletic League and has volunteered in many of their activities. He has also served as a Cub Scout master, coached football, coached basketball, and coached Teener League baseball. So welcome, Judge Morris. We're also pleased to have with us the Honorable Nathaniel C. Nichols, who is, more importantly, one of our former colleagues here at Widener University School of Law. Judge Nichols graduated from Howard University in 1970 and from Columbia University School of Law in 1973. He started his legal career at the Delaware County Legal Assistance Association, where he became the managing attorney. Judge Nichols then went into private law practice with the firm of Early, Nichols and Givens, and later formed the firm of Nichols and Givens. In 1986, Judge Nichols joined the faculty of Widener Law School on the Delaware campus as a clinical professor. In that role, he supervised law students who represented low-income clients before the Delaware County Court of Common Pleas. He also served as the Dean of Students and the Director of Clinical Programs while at Widener. Over his academic career, he wrote several law review articles and taught creditors' rights, consumer bankruptcy, domestic violence law, and property. In 2011, Judge Nichols was elected to the bench in the Court of Common Pleas of Delaware County. During his time as a judge, he served on the Juvenile Court Judges Commission. He retired from the bench in January 2019. He is a member of the American, Pennsylvania, and Delaware County Bar Associations. He was named a Child Advocate of the Year by the Pennsylvania Bar Association in 2018. It's our pleasure to have Judge Nichols with us. And as we have with our other panels, we have one more video to share with all of you.
Now we have Mr. James Baldwin, the star of the evening, who has been sitting, listening attentively, getting a wonderful reception here in the Cambridge Union. Tremendous enthusiasm from all sides of the House for Mr. Baldwin, who has been listening to the arguments. Now we'll bring the voice of actual experience to the debate.
Good evening. I find myself, not for the first time, in the position of a kind of Jeremiah. For example, I don't disagree with Mr. Burford that the inequality suffered by the American Negro population of the United States has hindered the American dream. Indeed, it has. I quarrel with some other things he has to say. The other deeper element of a certain awkwardness I feel has to do with one's point of view. I have to put it that way. One's sense, one's system of reality. It would seem to me that the proposition before the House, if I put it that way, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro, or the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro, is a question hideously loaded, and that one's response to that question, or one's reaction to that question, has to depend on an effect on where you find yourself in the world, what your sense of reality is, what your system of reality is. That is, it depends on assumptions which we hold so deeply as to be scarcely aware of them. A white South African, or a Mississippi sharecropper, or a Mississippi sheriff, or a Frenchman driven out of Algeria, all have, at bottom, a system of reality which compels them to, for example, in the case of the French exile from Algeria, to defend French reasons for having ruled Algeria. The Mississippi or the Alabama sheriff, who really does believe when he's facing a Negro boy or girl, that this woman, this man, this child, must be insane to attack the system to which he owes his entire identity. Of course, for such a person, the proposition of which we're trying to discuss here tonight does not exist. And on the other hand, I have to speak as one of the people who've been most attacked by what we must now here call the Western or the European system of reality. What white people in the world, because the doctrine of white supremacy, I hate to say it here, comes from Europe. That's how it got to America. Beneath then, whatever one's reaction to this proposition is, has to be the question of whether or not civilizations can be considered as such equal, or whether one civilization has the right to overtake and subjugate and in fact to destroy another. Now what happens when that happens? Leaving aside all the physical facts which one can quote, leaving aside rape or murder, leaving aside the bloody catalog of oppression, which we are in one way too familiar with already, what this does to the subjugated, the most private, the most serious thing this does to the subjugated, is to destroy his sense of reality. It destroys, for example, his father's authority over him. His father can no longer tell him anything because the past has disappeared, and his father has no power in the world. This means, in the case of an American Negro, born in that glittering republic, and in the moment you are born, since you don't know any better, every stick and stone and every face is white, and since you have not yet seen a mirror, you suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skins, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime, so that presently you realize you're 30 and are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It is by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end.
Defer to my elder colleague.
AKA kicked it, right? So when I was asked to make this presentation, and I knew this dealt with ethics, my first thought was to go to the rules of professional conduct. And I did not find those rules to be helpful at all in terms of what the conduct of the lawyer should be in terms of ethics. What I found helpful was the preamble and the scope of those rules. And let me just read what I found helpful. As a representative of clients, a lawyer performs functions such as an advisor, a negotiator. A lawyer has a special responsibility for the quality of justice. That's in the first paragraph. It is necessary for a lawyer to challenge the rectitude of official action. It is also the duty to uphold the legal process, and a lawyer, as a public citizen, is to improve the law and access to the legal system, administration of justice, and the quality of service. A lawyer should further a public's understanding and confidence in the rule of law and the justice system, and depend on popular participation and popular support to maintain their authority. A lawyer should be mindful of the deficiencies of the administration of justice and the fact that the poor, and sometimes persons who are not poor, cannot afford legal assistance. However, a lawyer is also guided by a personal conscience and the approbation of professional peers, and should exemplify professional ideals of public service. The legal profession is largely self-governing. So you, my future colleagues, will be governing this profession. You will be making those decisions as to what's best for the public, not just the profession. So my wife, gotta get some bonus points. My wife, who's right over there, the love of my life, taught in the primary grades at Wallingford Elementary, and she taught me more about the issue of race and how we should treat people by what she did in her classroom. So one of the things she would do is she would get kids in a circle, and they'd all hook arms and then have one child outside the circle who couldn't get in the circle. What do you think that said to that child? And what did those other students learn about inclusion? She would have a situation where they'd have, anybody know what a jungle gym is? Do they still have jungle gyms? Thank you. Okay. There would be a jungle gym, and she would say, okay, everybody can get on the jungle gym except those of you who have blue eyes. Whoa. Those of you who have blonde hair. Whoa. So now the students get to, oh, wait a minute. I'm being excluded because of just how I look, or I have the power to say, no, you can't participate because of how you look. Powerful lesson for those young people to be able to have at that particular time, because at that time they saw no color. Now, let me give you the example of my own neighborhood. So I have two sons. My older son, who was about 5 or 6 years old, my wife might correct me, and he decided to play with another young man. And we were probably the first Black couple in the block in suburban Philadelphia and Media, nice neighborhood. And he decided to play with his right friends, and he went up the street to play with this little boy and got called, police got called, said, by the neighbor who said, there's this kid here, get him. My son didn't know he was different. All my son knew was that he was in trouble because he was playing with his friend. Made no sense at all. Fortunately, I don't think it affected him to that extent. I mean, he's fine now. But can you think about that? That because of who you were or who they thought you were, they said, "No, you're out. You're out. You're out." So let's go historical here. So this is a letter to the editor, Federal Gazette, March 23, 1790. In your excellent paper, Speech of Mr. Jackson in Congress against their meddling with the affair of slavery or attempting to mend the condition of slaves, it put me in the mind of one made about 100 years since Sidi Mahmed Ibrahim. The African speech is translated as follows. If we cease our cruises against Christians, how shall we be furnished with commodities their countries produce, which are so necessary for us? If we forbear to make slaves of their people, who in this hot climate are to cultivate our lands? And is there not more compassion and more favor due us as Muslims than these Christian dogs? If we then cease taking and plundering the infidel ships and making slaves of seamen and passengers, our lands will become of no value for want of cultivation. Are not Spain, Portugal, France, and the Italian states governed by despots who hold all their subjects in slavery without exception? Even England treats its sailors as slaves, for they are, whenever the government pleases, seized and confined to ships of war. Let us hear no more of this detestable proposition, the manumission of Christian slaves. The result, as Martin tells us, is that the Divan made the resolution, the doctrine that plundering and enslaving the Christians is unjust, is at best problematical, but that it is in the interest of this state to continue the practice. Clearly, therefore, let the petition be rejected. Signature Historicus. Who wrote that? Yeah, it's a trick question, I know. Who wrote it? Who do you think wrote it? Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin, March 23rd, 1790. So he was aware of this issue of slavery and how slavery was a commodity to be used in the culture. Now, Benjamin Franklin is not to be held as innocent. He, in fact, I think he enslaved 2 women. I think his will said that one of them were to be manumitted upon his death, but he was aware of the idiocy of slavery. He was aware of that dichotomy, et cetera. So now let me finish by talking about Dr. King. Dr. King went to Croce Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. Spent a lot of time there. And during his time in Chester, Pennsylvania, he had the opportunity to meet a lot of the people that were there. And his mentor at that time was the Reverend Pius Barber. And he would talk to Pius Barber about what he was thinking. And even at that time, he began to think about the issue of civil rights. And he began to talk about passive resistance. And I'm getting this from Almenina Barber, who was Pius Barber's daughter, who teaches or taught at University of Pennsylvania Law School. And she said, when he would talk to Pius Barber about this idea of, passive resistance, Pius Barber said to him, and I quote, "Son, you keep talking like that, you can get yourself killed." So even then, Pius Barber, who was obviously, I think, more progressive, saw that what Martin Luther King was thinking about was right and progressive, but dangerous for the society at that time. But despite that fact, kept going. So you, my colleagues, my future colleagues, have that same responsibility. And I'm not saying you go out and get yourself killed. Don't misunderstand me. But you have the opportunity to do that because your slate's much more clear than mine is, or some of our other colleagues. And I'm not saying you have to pick something particularly that's earth-shattering, but think about your responsibility and the opportunities that you have because of the education that you've received and the brilliant way you can go about it through the legal system. Let's see. I think that's about it. Oh, no, mic drop. You ready for the mic drop? Well, I'm going to pay for this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Well, I'm going to pay for this. I'm going to pay for this. Love you. I'm going to pay for this. So, when I first heard from a good professor about This book, Notes of a Native Son. The introduction was written by Edward P. Jones. And in it, in his introduction, he says this: when I went up to college in 1968, I took a few books anticipating the adequacy of the library that awaited me at Holy Cross College. I packed only 2 books of notification, both bought in a used bookstore not long after I was accepted to college, but I never read them. The first was a ponderous 1950 tome on writing logical and well-reasoned essays. I was never to read it, perhaps because it was inaccessible. Seeing it on my dormitory room's bookshelf, this person, before his graduate from Holy Cross College in 1971, purchased the book from me for $5. That book by, of course, James Baldwin. Who purchased the book? Come on. Who purchased that book in that time? Who purchased that book? Ready? Mic drop. Clarence Thomas, thank you.
Good story. I'm sure he read it. All right. Good afternoon. We're there, yeah, now. So first, I'd like to thank Dean Hussey. I'd also like to thank Professor Lee. 16 years. I mean, that's something to be celebrated that they've been doing this, and I think we should, in fact, celebrate that. I'd also like to thank the leaders of the student organizations, because without them, you know, you wouldn't have folks who are actually advocating for the groups that I think are needed in the law school. Savannah, Reese, and Kelsey, I want to thank them for their introductions earlier today of their organizations. I think that's very important. And I'm going to sort of pick up where my colleague left off, but I'm also going to jump into where I think we get this Baldwin clip. And he talked about Jeremiah. And as he was talking about Jeremiah, I Googled Jeremiah on justice. And so here's what Jeremiah has to say about justice. Do justice and righteousness, and deliver the one who has been robbed from the power of his oppressor. That's what Jeremiah has to say about justice. And as he stood there saying, I am a modern day Jeremiah, he was speaking to that very point. So let me tell you, I listened to, before this presentation, I'd listened to Baldwin often. I'd read his books. I had the privilege of being at Temple University, where the Dr. Malefi Asante was the director of the African American Studies department, and I had the opportunity of taking many courses in that department. And what you're going to know about me is I have a hard time standing behind a podium. I was a trial lawyer, so it's going to be difficult. If I move away from the mic, I'll try to draw myself back. But I knew my history. So part of this is going to be participatory because history is important. So I'm going to draw you all into this because there's some things I think we all need to know as we consider and contemplate the words of James Baldwin. James Baldwin said this: ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy that justice can have. And haven't we seen that in our modern times? I got another quote for you. Because some of the things that happened that got us to this point didn't go without the knowledge of the people who allowed it to happen. And here is another quote. And I'm going to ask you who rendered this quote. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. And this person was talking about the institution of slavery. Who do you think that was? Students? Thomas Jefferson, the Thomas Jefferson. And so in talking about the institution of slavery, he said, we engage in despotism. We do these unnatural things to these people, and our children watch it and they imitate it. And have we not created this barbarism in our children? Read the letters, the Virginia letters, and you'll see what I'm telling you. This is, part of your education is not just the law books. In fact, I hated the law books. I liked reading the other stuff while I was in law school. But this is the person who we know as one of the founders of our nation. And he knew he had that moral knowing. And how did he get to create or be a part of the creation of this nation that abided slavery? This thing, and I'm going to use a psychological term, cognitive dissonance. Anybody know what that is? All right, students? Cognitive dissonance, what is it? I didn't answer the last time. All right, adults.
So it's, you should stop, but you can't and don't want to stop, and it's butting against each other.
Absolutely, great answer. All right. So he engaged in this, he had to, because how could you have a slave or an enslaved person? And let me clean up my language, because Dr. Molefi Asante told me about language liberation. And that person, that person we call a slave was not a slave. He was whoever he was called on his, in his homeland. That was his name. And they put a badge of enslavement upon him. So let me liberate my language. So if we look at the fact that these founding fathers knew that what they were doing was wrong, the only way that they could get to this point to continue doing it, and this is part of what Baldwin is railing against, is by engaging in this cognitive dissonance. Now, how did they do that? They dehumanized the people that they enslaved. So you no longer became a human being, you became something less. You ever hear somebody say a Black person was an ape, or they're primeval, or they're savages, as we did with the natives? Okay, I don't need to give you that history lesson, do I? Okay, this is not any of, well, unless you're native, this is not your native land. We are all here as non-natives, and the natives who can claim their heritage here are the rightful possessors of this land, okay? And not to complicate that, but so when we look at what they knew and what they did, they had to engage in this, what we call cognitive dissonance. And so out of that time period, for you young ladies in the room, when you go to get your gynecological services, there was this device called the vaginal speculum that they used to inspect that area. Do you know how that was developed? Anybody? Absolutely. They tested pewter spoons in the places that you do that to design that mechanism to be able to use it later on in a scientific and medical way. Because they said that African women were incapable of feeling the type of pain that a white woman would feel. And we know that that clearly is not true. I looked at a study that was from October of 2022. A Harvard, I think it was Yale. I actually brought the study with me, so I don't want to misquote. I want to make sure I reference the right. It was the Yale New Haven Health System. And they discovered that there was a biased testing procedure that was being used on African-American patients that was delaying their ability to get kidney transplants by close to 2.5 years. If you were white, you had a 2.5 year advantage on a Black kidney patient at getting a transplant. So we can't look at these things in a vacuum. History has significance. And as you hear Baldwin talk about the history of the things that troubled him, that is what we all have to grapple with when we try to have this society that embraces all of what America said it would embrace. Mary Love Hundley. That was my enslaved ancestor that I can trace back to on my mother's side. And there was a tale that we told in the family that Mary Love Hundley was worth her price in gold and that her slave master would never sell her. There's a picture of her, and she's a very fair-skinned African-American woman. And that story about her being worth her weight in gold and that her master wouldn't sell her, it's a nice story, isn't it? But the reality of that story is that Mary Love Hundley was probably the daughter of her enslaver. And she was probably the product of a rape. And so when we talk about our history, that's part of my personal history. But part of our collective history is that Thomas Jefferson also has children that are of African descent, and that his Sally Hemings story is a real story. And that's a part of our history, just like the founding of this country is a part of our history. And neither one of them is something that we can ignore. The fact is that he impregnated and had children with a teenage woman when he was a 40-some-year-old man. And so we know that he engaged in rape. And we can call it, we can nicety it up, and we can clean it up, but it is a part of our history. And let me give you another quote. This is a Maya Angelou quote. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, we need not live it again. And so that's why I pause on some of these things in history, because I know that without understanding our history, we can't move forward. So when I looked at this subject and I looked at what all the things that Baldwin had talked about, it made me consider where we are today. And where we are today is there is a railing against history. And let me make there's no mistake about this. Black history is American history. There is no mistake about that. And so our history is uniquely woven into this American story like nobody else's history. So when someone comes out with a 1619 project and they say, let me tell this story of America from another lens, we know it's true. You can go to Jamestown right now and there's a placard that tells you that enslaved people came to Jamestown. That's a part of our history. So if I can tell that history and it's true, why is society, some in society, railing against the telling of that history. And let me suggest something to you. Many, many years ago, and I've told this story before, I was asked to go speak, not many years ago, not many years ago. There are too many manys in there. I was asked to speak at Messiah College, and it was at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. And the Christians, Messiah is a Christian college, the Christian students there were struggling with this Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, and they asked me to come and to speak to a class of people about this. And at that time, I believe Tamir Rice may have been the name of and the face of what had happened, but there have been so many more after that. But I came, and what I did was I brought with me a picture. And it was, I brought it 3 by 4, it was big. And it was a picture of a lynching. And you can find it in a book called Without Sanctuary. And I would encourage anyone who wants to know about the history of lynching to, and it's part of your legal, as lawyers, you should know about that, because what was a lynching? A lynching was an extrajudicial murder without the benefit of a trial, right? Somebody took justice into their own hands. But anyhow, I bring this photograph of this lynching, and I begin my discussion with them by going through the lyrics of Billie Holiday's "Southern Trees Bear Strange Fruit." Who doesn't know that song? Probably none of you. All right, Billie Holiday has a song called "Southern Trees Bear Strange Fruit." Blood on the leaves, blood on the root, black bodies swinging on the poplar tree, a strange fruit. That was about lynching. And so I brought that photograph and I read the lyrics of Billie Holiday's song. I had the photograph covered up for a reason. And then I described to them the killing that had just occurred and how you cannot divorce it from its historical context. That there was a time where sheriffs and police and communities allowed people to be hung and killed without the benefit of any justice. And when you see someone murdered by those same forces, it brings back the memory of what used to be. And you can't escape that, because in that picture of that lynching, there were families having picnics, toddlers, teenagers, older adults, all looking at a body hung from a tree, burned to a crisp. People had dismembered the body, cut off genitals, took pieces of the body for souvenirs, while the sheriffs and the police and the town council, everyone in the city, got by, let it happen. And a lot of times we know these charges were fabricated, trumped up, whatever you want to call it. But that person never got the benefit of this justice that Baldwin was crying out for. And those students couldn't understand this cry for Black Lives Matter until they understood the history. And that's why history is so important. For the Eric Garners of the world, for the Tamir Rices of the world, for the George Floyds of the world, we can't put those matters into context until we understand the history. These extrajudicial killings, had a lot to do with, the reaction to them had a lot to do with the history in this country. So how do we confront history? We tell it, and we tell it from a truthful lens. We tell it from a truthful lens. You cannot understand Black Lives Matter without understanding lynchings, right? You can't understand Brown versus Board without understanding Plessy. Can't understand Plessy without understanding Dred Scott. And you can't understand any of these laws that we now confront ourselves with without understanding the historical context. But why is there sort of a railing against? And this is my own, this is getting into Royce Morris' opinion. None of this is, I can't point to a particular chapter and verse of this. But I saw something amazing in 2020. I saw Black, brown, white. I saw all kinds of people coalescing around this whole idea that Black lives matter. And when you saw those people that were peacefully protesting, they were from all races, all denominations. In fact, it went international. When that kneeling on that neck took this international, and it took the cause for the sanctity of a Black life to new heights. And then what happened? The erasure. Let's erase this history. Let's erase this history. And every great movement that there has been, after the movement, there has been great pushback. I love Brother Barack Obama, President Obama, but after President Obama, wasn't there some pushback? Just a little bit, right? Just a little bit. But that is the reality of what's happening now. So I say this, and I'm going to sum up my story. I'm not quite like the Baptist preacher. When I get close to the end, I'm going to end. So let me sum it up this way. We have to hold on to that history. And it's not my history as a Black man. It's your history. It's everybody's history because it's American history. You have to know that there was a Frederick Douglass. You have to know that there was a Sojourner Truth. You have to know that there was a Harriet Tubman. You have to know that there was a Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, a Carter G. Woodson, an Ella Baker. Look, we wouldn't have the music we have right now if it wasn't for some down-home brothers making that music sound good, right? So you have to know that. You have an obligation to know that history. You have to know that when you see that stoplight out there, that there was a Black man that helped design that stoplight. When you go to Washington, D.C. and drive around it, you have to know that there was a Black man who helped put that together. You should know these things because our children, my children, I made a point to let them know that, but they didn't learn it in the school. They had to learn it at home. They had to learn it from the encyclopedias that I got from Ebony and Jet magazine. And none of you even know what Ebony and Jet magazine is. You know, but there used to be a Jet Beauty of the Week in the middle of the page. And when I was younger, I used to look at that. When I got older, I said, I don't need to look at that. I need to look at the articles and what they're talking about. And that's where I got my Black history from, but it's not good enough. So my ode to Baldwin is Baldwin was a man of, he was a learned man. He was a man of letters. He was a man who loved knowledge. He had a thirst for knowledge and he had this striving in him for knowledge. And it forced him to challenge the systems that he was in because he knew that the people who were in those systems knew they were wrong. And if he thought that if I could just reason with them, come let us break bread together. He wasn't afraid. You saw that crowd that he was in. He wasn't afraid to put himself in that crowd And I hope you understand the reason why I speak the way that I speak is I'm not afraid to speak truth in any crowd. That's who I should be, and that's who you should be. But my ode to him is to say to all of us today that that history is relevant history. It's history that we cannot divorce ourselves from as much as we would try to divorce ourselves from. So I rail against anybody who would try to silence my history. I am not going to be erased. Mary Love Hundley is not going to be erased. And so I say to you, embrace this history, this rich history that is America, with all its complicated ways. It is the best promise that we have. It is the best hope that we have. And the institutions and the laws are set up. It's the beauty of this Constitution. And I had this argument and debate with some of my fellow colleagues. This Constitution is a beautiful thing because with the right people fighting for the rights, we can ensure the rights. We have that ability. They wrote a document that gives us the ability with the right moral will to create the nation that we want. And so that's my challenge to you as law students. The fact that you're here today, the fact that you've taken your time to be here, the fact that you've heard these great speakers, the fact that this is the 16th year of this event gives me hope. Every time I have a class here, it gives me hope. Every time I see students, it gives me hope because I know that you will challenge, you will think, and you will do. And hey, that's all we can expect, and that's all we hope for. But as I said, Mary Love Hundley will not be erased.
I'd like to thank both of the judges for their remarks. And I think Judge Morris let all of you off easy over here, presuming that you knew what a magazine is, first of all, before you even asked about Ebony and Jet. So that might have been the more fundamental first question to ask on that. But we have some time here for questions. I'd be happy to take them from here. Professor?
Sorry, I'll make it quick because I know you just listened to me, but I do want to ask our panelists, because this is something that I've been grappling with in my con law class, which is sort of our conversation about the framers and how we describe them. We kind of lump them all into one group. We know there were some framers who were abolitionists, some who were not, but who still didn't own slaves. Maybe they couldn't afford it. But I think for those framers who we do know were human property owners, I've been trying to just get more frank about who they are. And so I thought about your term cognitive dissonance. And I kind of refer to them a little bit differently in class. I refer to them as sociopaths, narcissists, sexually violent predators as someone who represented those clients. And so I think that there is a level of realness that perhaps we in this profession need to have about who these people are, especially in our current movement where richness and all of those things with movements are supposed to mean, no, we're still going to hold you accountable. So I think that we should sort of get more used to describing the framers in terms of who they are. Finally, I just want to say we should also get used to the idea that some of those ideas in the Constitution did not come from the framers. In fact, the bicameral system of government was actually based on indigenous law and indigenous nations and their relationships. And so I think if we are more real in our description, we can stop giving them credit that they don't really deserve. So thank you for this presentation.
Any thoughts or something? All right.
I just had a question for, I guess, all of the speakers present. As legal professionals, as academics, how do you reconcile watching other people that are in your demographic be on the opposite side of the spectrum and essentially harm the work that you believe in and the progress that you believe in? I'm a woman of color, and I see a lot of people who look like me that are, politicians, and I'm just so embarrassed because I'm like, what are you doing? Like, what are you saying? And so I guess, like, for example, the Clarence Thomas mic drop, like, how do you reconcile someone in such a position using his power for harm?
There's one at the table there.
Positive mind. It's something I got from just years in the martial art, and try to keep a positive mind about me and what I'm doing, because you can't affect sometimes these people. And so they're going to be the way they're going to be, whether we're talking about the founders, or whether we're talking about people in your class, or whether we're talking about people that are out there. Focus on you, keep your positive mind, and move forward. That's the thing I think about, because you can sit back and worry about it a lot, and I do too. But the more you say, I'm going to do something in my own way, and if it has a big impact, that's great. If it has a little impact, that's fine too. But keep that in mind. I'm going to stay positive about it. I'm going to do what I want to do about it and make a long-term commitment for it. Everybody's all psyched up now because you're in law school. Be that way 10 years from now. Be that way 20 years from now. Make that part of your career. And part of it starts with the idea of commitment to pro bono. Because guess what? Pro bono does not help rich people. Okay? Pro bono helps those people who need it the most. Make a commitment to pro bono. And it may be pro bono in class action. It may be pro bono just helping out somebody fill out an IFP in form of pauper's petition. Okay?
I guess I would answer that pretty much the same way. However, I'll use an analogy. It's chess and not checkers. So you're in it for the long game. You're in it to be strategic. The beauty of a law degree is that it gives you that ability to be strategic. You don't have to win every time. You just have to, build a case. You build a case on, you look at the civil rights movement. The Howard University Law School spawned all of these lawyers who sort of created this pipeline of legal challenges that led up to, coalesced with the civil rights movement. It was strategic. And so, as lawyers, we have the ability to think beyond that last loss in court. And so that's what I, ask you to do as young lawyers, to think strategic. If you see an injustice, you see something you don't like, you have this moral conviction about it, you have an ability to think beyond that first loss or that second loss or even that third loss, to how do you get to a point where, whatever it is you want, you can try to achieve. So I think it has to be more of a strategic process, especially when you become a lawyer and you're looking at the long game and not, the many losses that will come, because they will. But the victories that you can achieve if you have a long-term way of thinking about it.
So as a very shy person that works in the community, I just want to offer something up to the incoming lawyers in this field. And that is a quote that I like for all of us to live by when we're in public service. And that is, the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. You all have the ability, with everything going on, the resources at your fingertips, to really continue a moment if you stay focused on serving the masses in lieu of the chosen few. So that takes sacrifice, because the glitz and the glimmer and everything is telling you, be self-serving, get yours and then give to them. Do this, do that for you. To be selfish, in essence, is not selfless. And so I say, and I join in your efforts in simply saying, Never be comfortable and or content. Be cognizant and understanding that the difference between a moment and a movement is sacrifice. And we owe a debt of gratitude to our ancestors to continue the movement that was started, that we are now in these rooms benefiting from, having had sacrificed nothing. So the challenge is, as you leave and come into your various professions, to make sure that you remain committed to the moment and not merely a movement and not merely a moment.
Thank you. Well said. Other questions? Any from our folks online? All right, well, I think that's going to bring us to an end for our program today. For a few things before we completely wrap up, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to Professor Randy Lee for everything that he did in organizing this. Each year he always goes above and beyond. He is truly amazing on that. I'd like to thank the people here at Widener that were involved in the details. Brian Fernbaugh, who's been running our tech, Tara Mead, Paula Hyder, Bob and Lee for the setup, and Mark Hughes for lunch and everything else that's going into all of that later. We couldn't have done it without all of them, and very grateful to them for all of their work on that. And certainly to our panelists and our speakers today for their great remarks. Thank you for all of that. We've gotten even more to think about now and work to continue to do. So thank you for your time. Thank you for spending the day with us as well. And thank you to all of you for coming and for being a part of this. It's just really gratifying to see all of you here. And encouraging to know that, as I said at the beginning, we're called to be here and called to be here to be in this fight, and to know that there are people with us in that is certainly very edifying. So again, thank you to all of you for being here. So a couple of last things to wrap up. We have to draw out the raffle tickets for the painting. So we'll draw 2 names from that somewhere. I'm